Hey guys, tonight we're taking you inside a damp, reeking world of grime so creatively disgusting, you'll wonder how the human species didn't just collectively give up. We're not talking about buttoned-up etiquette, lace gloves, or neatly polished top hats. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to stay clean, or more accurately, fail spectacularly at it, in Victorian Britain. The overflowing chamber pots, the baths shared by entire families in cold, brown water, the public sanitation that smelled like an open sewer on a hot day, all baked into the daily rhythm of life. If you're enjoying our sleepy dives into history, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't wake to silence. You wake to the Victorian city announcing itself at full volume, and not just in sound, but in smell. The first thing that reaches you isn't light or birdsong. It's an odour that belongs entirely to this time and place. A rich, layered fog of coal smoke, manure and human waste that seeps into your nose before you even open your eyes. The coal smoke is the strongest note, a dense metallic haze that has been burning through the night in hearths across the city. It carries a faint sweetness, almost like burnt sugar, but with an acrid edge that scratches the back of your throat when you breathe in too deeply. Coal isn't just heating homes, it's feeding factories, warming bath water for the lucky few who have some, and choking the streets in a haze so familiar that most people barely notice it anymore. In winter, the smoke is so thick you can't see more than a few yards ahead. It clings to your clothes, your hair, even your eyelashes, and you'll carry the smell into every room you enter for the rest of the day. Beneath that comes the manure, the inevitable result of thousands of horses hauling carts, carriages and omnibuses through the streets from dawn until well past dusk. On an average day in London during the mid-19th century, the city's horses produce more than 1,000 tons of manure, and without any modern waste disposal system, it's left piled at the edges of the street until someone shovels it away, or until the next rain scatters it into a foul brown paste between the cobblestones. That same rain, pooling in low spots, releases a sharp ammonia bite when the sun hits it later in the morning. And then there's the human contribution. Sanitation reform is still in its infancy, and many streets have open gutters running along the sides. Chamber pots are emptied into them in the early hours, sending streams of urine and worse trickling toward the nearest drain, assuming there is one. The drains themselves often connect directly to the Thames, a river that doubles as the city's water supply. In the summer heat, the stench rises from the banks like steam from a cauldron, and even in the cooler months it's never far from your nose. You shift under the covers, which isn't much better. Your blanket is made of coarse wool that scratches at your skin, heavy and slightly damp from the night air. Beneath you, the mattress has long since given up on springiness. It's stuffed with straw or horsehair that has flattened into hard ridges over the years, and it holds moisture like a sponge, which would be comforting if that moisture weren't also an ideal habitat for fleas. You scratch at your ankle, hoping it's just an itch and not a bite. Rising from bed isn't a matter of stretching luxuriously and padding off to a hot shower. It's a negotiation with the cold air in the room, which bites at your face the moment you pull the blanket away. The fireplace hasn't been lit yet, so you dress quickly, layering undergarments, stockings and your outer clothes in the dim light. The smell of the room, a mix of stale air, unwashed fabric and last night's coal fire, follows you as you move toward the washstand. The washstand is the Victorian equivalent of your morning sink, a wooden table with a porcelain basin and a matching pitcher, usually filled the night before with water carried up from the pump. This water is now ice cold and carries a faint metallic tang from the pipes, if you're lucky enough to have them, or a faint earthy smell if it came from a shared pump. You splash it onto your face in quick bursts, not so much to clean as to wake yourself up. If you have soap, it's a hard brown bar that smells faintly of tallow. It cleans, in the sense that it removes dirt, but it leaves your skin dry and tight, as though it's taken more than just the dirt with it. Teeth get a quick once-over, but the tools are primitive. Toothbrushes exist, but their bristles are made from animal hair and attached to wooden or bone handles. They're stiff, they fray quickly, and they can become home to bacteria if not carefully dried. A fact no one knows yet because bacteria are still a mystery to most. Many people use tooth powder instead, which is stored in a small tin. The powder is usually made from chalk, charcoal, ground cuttlefish bone, or even powdered brick. It scours the surface of your teeth but also shaves away the enamel, leaving a sandpaper finish that makes you feel cleaner but more vulnerable. By the time you've finished your minimal routine, the street outside is already alive. The rhythmic clop of hooves on cobblestone, the rattle of cartwheels, the shouted calls of costermongers selling yesterday's produce. All of it mixes with the smells pouring in through the window. Bakeries are pulling the first loaves of bread from their ovens, the yeasty warmth battling with the coal smoke for dominance in the air. Somewhere down the street, vinegar is being splashed across a shop front as a crude disinfectant, its sharp tang briefly cutting through the background stench. Stepping outside means surrendering entirely to the atmosphere. The fog clings to your coat, and within minutes, it's absorbed into the fibres, making your outer garments heavier. Wool is a blessing for warmth, but a curse for odour. It traps smells with the tenacity of a sponge, and they don't wash out easily. Within the first hour of your day, you've collected a sampler platter of scents: coal smoke, wet wool, street waste, and perhaps a faint note of fish from the stall you passed on the corner. Every breath tastes like the city. Every surface you touch leaves a faint layer of grime on your fingers, and there is no escaping it, because the Victorian city is not just a place you live in. It's a place that clings to you, in your clothes, your hair, your skin, even in your dreams. When you lie down tonight, your bed will smell of the same city air you're smelling now, and when you wake tomorrow, the stench will be waiting for you again, patient, familiar, and utterly unavoidable. Bathing in the Victorian city is not part of a daily routine. It's not even part of most weekly routines. For many, it is an event, an ordeal that takes planning, physical labour, and a small sacrifice of dignity. This is the age before indoor plumbing is common, before hot water gushes from taps at the twist of a handle. If you want a bath, you must make it happen, step by exhausting step. It starts with the water. Unless you are among the wealthier city residents, there is no pipe leading directly into your bathroom, because you likely don't have a bathroom at all. Instead, someone must fetch the water from a pump or a tap in the courtyard, carried in heavy buckets that slosh and spill with every step. Each bucket weighs more than 20 pounds when full, and you'll need several to fill even a modest tub. In winter, the water is so cold it can numb your fingers after just a few seconds of contact. Next comes the heating. The buckets are poured into large kettles or copper boilers, set over a coal or wood fire. The process is slow. Coal burns hot but takes time to catch, and the thick iron or copper must warm before the water inside even begins to steam. In wealthier homes, a servant might tend to this chore, keeping a rotation of heating vessels going so the water can be poured into the tub in stages. In poorer homes, the entire process happens in the same room you live, cook, and sleep in, which means your bathroom smells faintly of last night's dinner, and whatever the neighbours are cooking 2 floors below. The tub itself might be made of tin, copper, or wood, and is usually portable. It's set in front of the kitchen fire for warmth, because bathing in the middle of an unheated room in January is an experience that can rattle your bones. Privacy is minimal. Even in middle-class households, bathing might happen with family members bustling in and out, and in the poorest homes, it happens in full view of whoever else happens to share the room. Soap is not the soft-scented bar you might imagine from later eras. Victorian soap is a utilitarian block of harsh, lye-heavy fat, sometimes mixed with sand or pumice for extra scrubbing power. It smells faintly of tallow, a reminder that animal fat is one of its main ingredients, and it can strip oils from your skin so aggressively that your hands feel stiff afterward. Carbolic soap, with its strong medicinal scent, is also common, marketed as antiseptic long before most people understand what that means. The actual bathing process is quick. Water cools fast, especially in winter, and once it's lukewarm, the experience becomes less about comfort and more about endurance. You wash what you can, as thoroughly as the temperature and time allow, and then you get out before you start shivering uncontrollably. Hair washing is rare. Water is heavy, soap is harsh, and the drying process is slow. Instead, hair might be cleaned with powders like starch or even ground orris root to absorb grease and mask odours. But here's the part that would make a modern bather blanch. Unless you are very wealthy, you are not the only one using that bathwater. In families, everyone takes their turn in the same tub, starting with the eldest or most senior and working down to the youngest. By the final turn, the water has gone from cloudy to nearly opaque, with a surface film of soap scum and whatever else was removed from the previous bathers. The idea that water can be too dirty to bathe in is less of a concern than the fact that hauling and heating new water is a monumental task. For those without the space or resources to bathe at home, public bathhouses are an option, though they are not exactly luxurious. Built in the mid-19th century as part of public health reforms, these facilities are meant to provide cleanliness to the working classes. For a small fee, you can rent a small cubicle with a tub or shower, often with lukewarm water at best. The air is thick with steam, the floors are perpetually damp, and the smell is a mixture of soap, sweat, and mildew. Privacy is minimal, and the thought of how many people have used the same tub before you is not a question worth dwelling on if you want to enjoy the experience. Interestingly, many Victorians believe that too much bathing is unhealthy. Medical advice at the time often warns against overwashing, which is thought to strip away protective oils and weaken the body's defences against illness. Some physicians recommend only a full bath once a month, with smaller spongings in between. This fits well with the logistical difficulties of bathing, but it also means that for most people, the faint sheen of grime on the skin is considered perfectly normal. Once you're done, you step out into the chill air, wrapping yourself in whatever towel you own, which is often just a piece of linen or rough cotton that does more smearing than drying. Your skin is pink from scrubbing, your hair is damp, and there's a temporary feeling of freshness that feels like a small miracle. You know it won't last. Within an hour of stepping outside, coal smoke and city grime will begin to settle on you again. By evening, your collar will show a faint shadow of sweat and soot. Still, for those few hours after a bath, there is a difference. A slight lightness, a clean scent if you lean close enough to your own skin. You feel, briefly, like you've hit a reset button on the week, even if it's just an illusion. And you know that next week, when the tub is dragged out again and the water starts heating, you'll endure it all over again, because in Victorian life, the bath is less about indulgence and more about survival. You might think of Victorian clothing as crisp and immaculate. White collars so sharp they could slice bread, waistcoats that look as if they've just stepped out of a tailor's shop, and long skirts that sweep elegantly across polished floors. That's the image the photographs left you. But photographs in this age are lies of omission. They don't capture the smell. They don't capture the texture of weeks-old sweat baked into wool. And they certainly don't tell you how rarely those immaculate garments actually saw a wash basin. In your world, laundry is a matter of pushing buttons. In the Victorian world, it's a back-breaking, all-day labour that requires careful planning, a small army of equipment, and the willingness to wrestle boiling water without scalding yourself. In most households, laundry happens once a week if you're lucky, once a fortnight if you're not, and once a month if you're living in the poorest conditions. That means the shirt you put on Monday is probably still on Friday's shoulders, and perhaps even next Monday's too. It starts with the water, as it always does in this century. Gallons upon gallons must be fetched by hand, hauled in from the pump or the tap in the yard. Then it must be heated over a fire, which is no quick process. Laundry water needs to be boiling to have any hope of lifting dirt and grease from thick Victorian fabrics. Coal or wood fires roar all morning just to keep the kettles full and the wash tubs steaming. Clothes are separated into two main piles, white and not white. The whites are boiled with soap shavings or soda crystals, stirred with a wooden dolly, a plunger-like tool that lets you churn the garments without plunging your own hands into the scalding water. The non-whites get a slightly gentler treatment, but gentle is a relative term. Everything is scrubbed against a washboard, pounded with a dolly stick, or even slapped against a flat stone in rural areas. The goal isn't to preserve fabric softness, it's to beat the dirt into submission. Soap is a harsh companion. Lye-based and unrefined, it strips the fibres of oils and dyes, meaning that every wash shortens the life of a garment. Wool can shrink into a child-sized version of itself in a single bad laundering. Cotton yellows over time, and those delicate laces you picture in romantic novels. They often survive only a handful of washes before fraying beyond repair. Then comes the rinsing, another round of hauling and heating water, followed by wringing. Clothes are twisted and squeezed by hand or run through a mangle, a set of heavy rollers that flatten fabric and force out the water. It's hard on the hands, hard on the back, and hard on the clothes themselves. Drying is another battle entirely. There are no tumble dryers, no heated racks. In fine weather, garments are pegged to lines in the yard, flapping like flags in the smoky wind. In winter or rain, they're draped indoors near the fire, filling the house with a humid cloud of damp fabric and coal smoke. This slow drying process leaves many clothes smelling faintly of mildew, a scent that can linger even after being freshened outdoors. The starching and ironing follow. Collars, cuffs, and shirt fronts are stiffened with boiled starch, giving them that sharp, rigid look seen in portraits. The ironing is done with heavy cast iron tools heated directly on the stove, which must be tested for temperature by touching them to a scrap of cloth, or the back of your hand if you're careless. Too cool and wrinkles remain. Too hot, and you scorch the fabric or melt the starch into a sticky glaze. And here's the thing, because the process is so grueling, people do everything they can to delay it. This means clothing is worn for days or even weeks between washes. Underclothing, chemises, drawers, undershirts, are meant to absorb sweat and protect outer garments. But when those two are laundered infrequently, the system collapses. The layers themselves become walking archives of dust, body odour and soot. Instead of constant washing, Victorians rely on airing clothes to make them more tolerable. Garments are hung outside for a few hours to catch the breeze, or placed near a fire to freshen up. This doesn't remove the dirt, it simply redistributes the smell, replacing some of the sweat with a hint of smoke. In winter, airing clothes indoors means they pick up the scent of whatever is cooking, which could be anything from mutton stew to boiled cabbage. Even newly laundered clothing doesn't smell clean in the modern sense. At best, it smells faintly of coal smoke and wet fabric. At worst, it smells of the soap itself, a sharp animal fat tang that clings to your cuffs and hems for days. When you put on your Sunday best, you're not donning something pristine, you're simply wearing the least dirty option available. For wealthier households, laundering is often outsourced to washerwomen, who collect the clothes, boil and scrub them in communal facilities, and return them a few days later. But this is expensive, and even then, garments might return slightly discoloured, missing a button, or with a new tear from overzealous scrubbing. For the working poor, laundry is a homebound chore, done in cramped rooms where steam turns the air into a damp fog and every surface becomes slippery with condensation. By the end of the day, your hands would be raw, your back aching, and your clothes still slightly damp. And this is considered success. This is as fresh as clothing gets in the Victorian city. The illusion of crispness is maintained with starch, pressing, and strategic use of perfume. But deep down, everyone knows the truth. Every collar, every dress, every coat carries the memory of countless wears, countless streets, countless days lived in a cloud of coal smoke and human sweat. So when you see a portrait of a Victorian gentleman with his immaculate tie, or a lady in a spotless white gown, remember this. The image might be clean, but the reality was always a little musty. You've made it through the day in the Victorian city, through the smoke, the grime, the unwashed laundry, and now comes the evening. But before you get too comfortable in your creaky bed, there's a pressing matter to attend to. Nature calls. And in a world where indoor plumbing is a rare luxury, answering involves a piece of furniture that is both an essential household item and a deeply unpleasant one to think about: the chamber pot. The chamber pot is exactly what it sounds like. A portable toilet, usually a ceramic or metal bowl kept under the bed or inside a wooden commode. Its purpose is simple: to save you from stumbling through the cold, dark streets in search of an outhouse or public privy during the night. But convenience comes with a cost, and that cost is the smell. There's no flush to whisk away your contribution. Instead, whatever you deposit sits there until morning. If you're lucky, your pot has a fitted lid, which does little more than disguise the sight rather than the smell. The air in your bedroom, already thick with the scent of damp wool, unwashed linens and stale coal smoke, now carries a sharp new note of ammonia. You try to ignore it. Victorians are masters of ignoring smells. For the wealthiest households, emptying the chamber pots falls to servants. In the morning they carry them, carefully, but not carefully enough to prevent the occasional slosh, to be emptied into the cesspit or, in some cases, directly into the street gutters. In poorer homes, there's no one to delegate to. You, or another family member, do the job yourself. It's a humbling experience, balancing a sloshing pot of your own waste down a narrow staircase, trying not to make eye contact with the neighbours doing the same. And here's where the etiquette comes in. Even something as private as chamber pot usage has unwritten rules. You don't leave a full pot for someone else to deal with, at least not if you want to stay on good terms. You don't spill on the stairs, though it happens often enough that the smell becomes part of the building's permanent identity. You certainly don't put it off for days, unless you want to risk the pot overflowing in the night. Now multiply this by an entire street's worth of households, each with their own pots to empty. The waste doesn't vanish. It has to go somewhere, and that's where the night soil men come in. The night soil men are the unsung, underpaid, and frequently reviled sanitation workers of the Victorian city. Their job? Collecting human waste from cesspits and privies, often under cover of darkness. In theory, they operate on a regular schedule, arriving in the early hours to shovel out the accumulated waste, load it into carts, and haul it away. In reality, their work is unpredictable, dangerous, and almost unimaginably unpleasant. Imagine stepping into a narrow backyard behind a tenement building where a brick-lined pit sits beneath a crude wooden seat. This pit has not been emptied in months. The surface is a shifting mosaic of waste and debris. The smell so powerful it feels like a physical force pressing against your face. Armed with long-handled shovels, the night soil men begin their work, digging into the sludge, lifting it into barrels and trying not to lose their footing. They work by lantern light, the flickering glow illuminating just enough to make you wish you couldn't see. The stench clings to their clothes, their hair, their skin. People cross the street to avoid walking near them during the day, not just because of the smell, but because of the association. In Victorian society, sanitation work is considered the lowest of the low, essential but invisible, until something goes wrong. And things go wrong often. Cesspits overflow into basements, heavy rains wash street waste into the rivers. In the summer of 1858, the situation reached a crisis point. The Great Stink hit London when a particularly hot spell caused the Thames to reek so intensely that it shut down Parliament. Lawmakers were forced to confront the reality that their city's waste disposal system was little more than a patchwork of neglect and hope. But even after major sewer projects began, chamber pots remained a fixture in many homes well into the late 19th century. Indoor flush toilets were expensive to install and required reliable water pressure, something still lacking in poorer neighbourhoods. For many, the chamber pot was simply part of life, as normal as the bed it sat under. By morning, the streets bear the traces of their nightly ritual. Gutters run with a thin, foul-smelling trickle. Rats, always opportunistic, scurry along the edges. Shopkeepers throw down sawdust or sprinkle lime to mask the odours in front of their businesses. But the air is still tinged with ammonia, mingling with the smell of coal smoke and fresh bread in the city's strange daily perfume. If you live here, you stop noticing after a while. Your nose learns to filter it out. But when you leave the city for the countryside and breathe air that doesn't carry the ghost of human waste, it feels like stepping into another world. And then, when you return, the city welcomes you back with the same scent it has always worn. The one you tried to ignore, but could never truly escape. You can't talk about Victorian hygiene without eventually ending up at the river. The Thames was the lifeline of London, a source of water, a transport route, and the city's liquid garbage bin. It carried merchant ships, passenger ferries, and unfortunately the contents of thousands of chamber pots and open drains. By the mid-19th century, the river wasn't just dirty. It was an open wound running through the city, and in the summer of 1858, it festered into something so spectacularly awful that history still calls it by name, the Great Stink. To understand it, picture the river as it was before things went truly wrong. For centuries, the Thames had taken in human waste, industrial runoff, and animal carcasses without much protest. Tanners dumped the sludgy remains of hides. Slaughterhouses sent blood and offal straight into the current. Factories discharged dyes, chemicals, and grease. And every household, whether in a grand townhouse or a cramped tenement, contributed its own share of waste through cesspits, gutters, or pipes that emptied directly into the river. But then came the population boom. London swelled to over 2 million people by mid-century, and all of them had to put their waste somewhere. The city's old system of cesspits began to overflow. New sewers were built, but they didn't lead to treatment plants. They led straight to the Thames. In effect, the Victorians had created the perfect conveyor belt, efficiently delivering raw sewage into the same river they drew their drinking water from. Most of the time, the smell was bad but survivable. On cooler days, the wind might carry it away, and the surface scum could almost be ignored. But in June of 1858, London was hit with a heat wave. The sun baked the water until it steamed. Low tides exposed thick mud flats along the banks, and those mud flats were not made of ordinary mud. They were layered with decades of decaying organic matter, a mix of silt, rotted vegetation, and the concentrated remains of everything the city had been dumping into the river for years. When the heat hit, the Thames released its secrets. The smell rolled off the water in waves, a suffocating mix of rotting fish, manure, and something far worse, the sweet cloying odour of decomposing flesh. It clung to clothes and hair, coated the inside of your mouth, and turned every meal into a challenge. The newspapers described it as unbearable. People who lived near the river stuffed their windows with curtains soaked in chloride of a lime, hoping to block out the stench. Some went further, hanging sheets drenched in vinegar or even carbolic acid. It didn't help. The smell was so pervasive that Parliament, which sits right on the river's edge, nearly had to shut down. Members debated whether they could continue their work with the windows open. They couldn't. Or whether they should simply adjourn until the heatwave broke. Desperate, they ordered the curtains inside the House of Commons to be treated with lime, but the smell still crept in. One MP reportedly joked that the Thames had become a great open sewer. The joke landed because it was true, and here's the grim punchline. The stench wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. The river water wasn't just foul-smelling, it was lethal. At the time, the dominant medical theory blamed diseases like cholera on miasma, bad air. The idea was that foul smells carried illness, which made the Great Stink feel like a public health crisis in real time. But even though the theory was wrong about the mechanism, it was accidentally right about the danger. The real killer was the water itself, teeming with bacteria invisible to the human eye. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were common among those who lived or worked near the river, but without germ theory widely accepted, few connected the dots. For the average Londoner, the Great Stink was not some isolated event. It was the worst version of something they lived with every day. A city in which the main waterway was both life and poison. Boatmen still worked the river, holding handkerchiefs to their noses. Ferries still crossed, their passengers breathing through mouthfuls of tobacco smoke in a vain attempt to mask the smell. Markets along the bank still sold fish, though one can only imagine the aroma of fresh catch mingling with the scent of the water it came from. Eventually, the crisis became too big to ignore. The stench was so strong and so widely reported that the government finally authorised major sewer works under the direction of engineer Joseph Bazalgette. Over the next decade, he designed and built a vast system of underground sewers that diverted waste downstream, far from the city's central water supply. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of its time, and in many ways it saved London from itself. But in 1858, standing on the riverbank in the heat, none of that relief had yet arrived. All you could do was endure. The sound of the water lapping against the stones was deceptive, almost peaceful, until you realised what was in it. A dead dog floated by, bloated and pale. A film of grease swirled on the surface, broken by bubbles rising from whatever lay decomposing in the silt below. The gulls wheeled overhead, shrieking, attracted by the feast the river offered. The great stink didn't just define a summer, it defined an era. It was the moment when the polite illusion of the Victorian city as a place of refinement was stripped away by the most primal, undeniable truth of urban life. If you pack millions of people together without a plan for what to do with their waste, the waste will eventually take over. The Thames was proof of that. A broad, slow-moving reminder that beneath the corsets and top hats, Victorian London was still just a collection of human bodies, and every one of them had to go somewhere. And when they did, the river was waiting. You might think that if there was one part of the body the Victorians would have prioritised keeping clean, it would be the hair. After all, the 19th century was an age obsessed with appearances, glossy curls, elaborate styles, and portraits that made every head look like it belonged in a painting. But here's the dirty little truth. Victorian hair care was less about cleaning, and more about managing a slow descent into grease, dust, and desperation. The first problem is simple. Washing hair with water and soap is a terrible idea when your only available soap is the harsh, lye-heavy kind meant for laundry and dishes. Use that on your scalp more than once in a while, and your hair won't just squeak with cleanliness. It will break, frizz, and fall out in handfuls. So most people simply don't wash their hair often. Once every few weeks, if that. Some stretch it into months. Instead, hair is refreshed, with powders and oils designed not to clean but to disguise the problem. Enter dusting powders. Imagine sprinkling flour, starch, or finely ground orris root onto your head, then brushing it through to absorb grease. It works, in the sense that your hair looks less like an oil slick, but it also leaves behind a faintly chalky residue. Lean too close to someone in dark clothing, and they'll carry away a ghostly dustprint of your scalp. Orris root was particularly popular because it added a floral scent, a welcome distraction in a world where everything already smelled like coal smoke and sweat. But powders were only half the equation. To style hair and keep it in place, Victorians turned to oils and pomades, and among these, one stood out for both its effectiveness and its sheer oddity: bear grease. Yes, actual fat rendered from bears. Imported from North America and sold in little pots, bear grease was marketed as a miracle treatment. It was supposed to make hair shinier, stronger, and even promote growth. Advertisements promised that a dab of this pungent ointment would transform limp strands into thick, lustrous locks. The reality was less glamorous. Bear grease has a distinctive smell, gamey, musky, with a hint of rancid fat if it's gone off, which it often did. Once applied, it leaves your hair slick and shiny, but not in the glossy, healthy sense. More in the your head now resembles a waxed boot sense. The grease attracts dust and soot, which cling to your hair with stubborn determination. After a few days in the city, Your carefully styled ringlets might hold their shape, but they also carry the faint crunch of coal dust ground into the oil. If you couldn't afford imported bear grease, substitutes were everywhere. Lard, tallow, or even goose fat could be rubbed into the hair with similar effect. Some pomades were scented with lavender or rosemary to cover the underlying odour. Others went further, adding ingredients like beeswax or even spermaceti, a waxy substance harvested from the heads of sperm whales. Imagine walking through a crowded Victorian street knowing that the sheen on your neighbour's hair might actually be whale oil. For men, hair oiling was almost compulsory. The fashionable look was a smooth, glossy head of hair, parted neatly and often accompanied by facial hair, styled into equally oiled moustaches or beards. Pomade recipes varied, but many included petroleum jelly, newly available thanks to advances in refining. This had the advantage of being cheap and plentiful, but it gave hair the consistency of polished leather and a smell that could best be described as industrial. The side effects were predictable: scalps clogged with oil, paws struggling under layers of grease, and the ever-present company of lice. Head lice were a fact of life in Victorian society, and thick pomades only made matters worse by giving the insects a comfortable environment. Dusting powders could mask the shine of greasy hair, but they did nothing for the itching. Some people resorted to vinegar rinses or herbal infusions of rosemary or sage, but these were occasional treatments, not daily practices. Then there were wigs. While less common than in the 18th century, wigs still had their place, especially among the elderly or those with thinning hair. And wigs required their own upkeep: dusting, brushing, and occasional delousing. A wig soaked with sweat and pomade after a summer day in the city was a biohazard in its own right. The hairbrush itself became a key tool of hygiene, more so than soap and water. Brushing vigorously, sometimes for hundreds of strokes a day, was believed to spread natural oils evenly through the hair, keeping it shiny and healthy. It worked in a way, but it also redistributed whatever grime, soot and pomade was already there. Brushes had natural bristles set into wooden backs, and they accumulated their own build-up of grease, dust, and hair over time. Cleaning a brush meant picking through it with a comb and rinsing it in ammonia or vinegar, if you remembered to bother. Perfumes and scented waters filled the final gap. Bay rum, rose water, and lavender oil were dabbed onto hair to disguise the smell of grease and sweat. But like powdering clothes instead of washing them, this was surface-level maintenance. The result was a head of hair that looked respectable at a distance, but revealed its true state the moment you got close enough to catch a whiff. Hair fashion itself reflected these realities. Elaborate styles, curls, braids, and updos weren't just about looking elegant. They were practical ways to contain hair that wasn't exactly fresh. Braiding helped conceal grease, and pins kept unwashed strands neatly in place. For women, bonnets and hats served as both fashion statements and olfactory shields, holding in smells while covering up less than clean roots. Even in the upper classes, where access to better oils and scented pomades was common, the underlying truth remained the same. Hair was not washed the way you think of washing it today. It was managed, disguised, perfumed, and styled into submission. It was not so much clean as socially acceptable. So when you picture a Victorian ball, with candlelight glittering off carefully coiffed heads, remember this: the shine you see might not be health. It might be bear grease, layered with starch powder, touched up with lavender, and carrying just a hint of the Thames fog. And when the dancers spin too close, the smell isn't perfume alone. It's the entire complex bouquet of Victorian hygiene, condensed into a hairstyle that could probably fuel a lantern if you lit a match near it. You've managed your chamber pot at home, you've endured the smell of the Thames, and you've even slicked your hair with something that might once have been part of a bear. But what happens when nature calls and you're not at home? What happens when you're out in the Victorian city surrounded by people, with no chamber pot under the bed to save you? The answer, unfortunately, is one of the least dignified chapters in the history of public sanitation: the Victorian public toilet. Now, the idea of public toilets wasn't new. Ancient Rome had them after all, and quite efficiently too. But by the 19th century, most European cities had lost that infrastructure and replaced it with little more than wishful thinking. In London, the first true public conveniences didn't appear until the mid-1800s, and when they did, they immediately revealed the clash between modern ambition and old-fashioned waste management. The biggest issue was simple: demand. The city was enormous, filled with workers, shoppers, and travellers who all needed facilities, but toilets were few and far between. In the early days, they were often nothing more than a row of crude wooden stalls built over cesspits, with little ventilation and no reliable system for emptying them. After a few weeks of steady use, the pits filled, the smell grew unbearable, and the whole structure became unusable. If you've ever walked past a neglected portable toilet at a modern festival, multiply that experience by about 100. The smell hit you long before you saw the building, a mixture of ammonia, rotting waste, and damp wood. The floors were usually wet, though you'd rather not think about why. Flies hovered in clouds, undisturbed by the half-hearted attempts at cleanliness. And of course, there was no running water. For men at least, there was another option: the urinal. Cast iron structures, often decorative, began appearing on street corners in the mid-19th century. Known as pissoirs in Paris and Vespasiennes in London, they were supposed to be discreet, but in reality they were anything but. The tall iron panels shielded you from the street, but they did nothing to contain the sound or the smell. Walk downwind, and you knew exactly what was going on behind the metal screens. In hot weather, the stench of urine could cling to an entire block. Women, of course, had it worse. Public conveniences for women were practically non-existent, largely because polite society insisted that women simply shouldn't be out long enough to need them. The Victorian assumption was that a respectable lady would stay home or plan her outing so carefully that the issue would never arise. The result? Women often had no choice but to endure discomfort, cut their trips short, or resort to desperate measures, like using the same chamber pots hidden under market stalls that the vendors themselves might employ. Even when public facilities existed, access wasn't equal. Many charged a fee, often a penny, which might sound trivial, but for the working poor it was an added expense on top of everything else. Hence the origin of the phrase "spend a penny." But even after paying, there was no guarantee of a functional or clean experience. Toilets frequently clogged, drains backed up, and the water supply was too unreliable to flush them properly. A so-called modern convenience could easily turn into a public nuisance within weeks. The sanitation movement, spurred by crises like the Great Stink, did eventually push for improvements. Engineers like George Jennings pioneered pay-to-use flushing toilets, debuting them at the Great Exhibition of 1851. These monkey closets, as they were called, became a sensation. Visitors could pay a penny to use a clean, flushing water closet, complete with towels, soap, and even a shoe shine. Nearly 1 million people used them during the exhibition, proving there was demand. Yet outside of controlled settings, rolling that system out across a filthy, overcrowded city proved far more difficult. And so the streets carried on with their less elegant solutions. Many people simply relieved themselves wherever they could: alleys, stairwells, even dark corners of the street. Laws against public urination and defecation existed, but enforcement was sporadic at best. For the average Londoner in the 1860s, the line between a city and a giant open latrine could feel dangerously thin. This casual approach to public hygiene had predictable consequences. Human waste mixed with horse manure and industrial runoff to create a near-constant film of filth on the streets. When it rained, gutters carried the slurry straight into the Thames. When it was dry, dust kicked up by traffic carried particles of it into the air. The smell wasn't just in the toilets themselves, it was woven into the very fabric of the city. There's also the question of dignity. Imagine navigating a crowded marketplace, desperately needing relief, only to find the nearest facility either locked, overflowing, or strictly reserved for men. You might pay a penny to use one of the new flushing closets, only to discover there's no paper, just a communal sponge or a handful of straw. And then there's the final insult. You walk back into the street smelling faintly of lime and sewage, carrying with you the unmistakable aura of someone who just spent a penny in a city that can't quite figure out what to do with its waste. So while Victorian society prided itself on progress, invention, and refinement, the truth was that something as simple as going to the bathroom could be a logistical nightmare. Public toilets rarely worked as intended, and even when they did, they were surrounded by smells, fees, and inequalities that made them far from the civilizing force they were meant to be. And that's why many people stuck with the chamber pot, unpleasant as it was. At least at home, the stink was your own. You've managed to avoid the chamber pot spill on the stairs. You've walked past the public urinal cloud without choking. And now, in the bustle of the Victorian city, you're thirsty. After all, trudging through coal smoke, manure and fog makes you crave a drink. You want something refreshing, clear, safe. But here's the problem. In Victorian London, the very act of drinking water was like buying a lottery ticket with cholera as the jackpot. Let's start with the basics. The Thames, majestic river of empire, was also the city's primary water source, and as you've already learned, it doubled as the sewer. Waste from households, slaughterhouses, factories, and yes, chamber pots all ended up in the river. The same river from which water companies scooped their supplies. They pumped it up, ran it through settling tanks that removed the larger chunks, and then piped it directly into homes. Imagine pouring yourself a glass of water that looked clear enough but carried a deadly secret invisible to the eye. At the time, no one really understood germs. The prevailing belief was that diseases like cholera spread through miasma, bad air. Smells, not microbes, were the culprit. If a river stank, it was dangerous. If it smelled fine, it was safe. This logic had an unfortunate flaw. Cholera has no smell. A bucket of clear-looking water could contain enough Vibrio cholerae to level an entire neighbourhood, and people would drink it with confidence, only to collapse hours later with unstoppable diarrhea and dehydration. Cholera outbreaks became a regular part of city life in the 19th century. In 1832, one swept through London, killing more than 6,500 people. Another in 1849 killed 14,000. And in 1854, the infamous Soho outbreak struck, killing over 600 in just a few weeks. The victims often died within hours of showing symptoms, their bodies shrivelling from fluid loss so rapidly that families barely had time to call a doctor before planning a funeral. What made these outbreaks even more tragic was how preventable they were. Dr. John Snow, a physician, not the guy from Game of Thrones, noticed a pattern during the 1854 Soho epidemic. He mapped the cases and traced them to a single water pump on Broad Street. After persuading officials to remove the pump handle, the outbreak subsided. It was one of the earliest, clearest demonstrations that cholera was waterborne. But at the time, Snow's theory was controversial. The miasma model had centuries of authority behind it, and many dismissed his findings as coincidence. Meanwhile, water companies continued to pump the Thames into homes, sometimes from points just downstream of major sewage outlets. In 1850, one company proudly advertised its new waterworks, located directly below the outfall of a major sewer. The logic. The water looked clearer than before, because the tide carried away some of the debris. That was good enough. If you lived in a working-class tenement, your water supply might not even come from a pipe. Instead, you shared a standpipe in the street, open for just a few hours a day. People queued with buckets, pails, and anything else that could hold liquid. Contamination was guaranteed, as dirty vessels were dipped in and out. In hot weather, the stored water turned green with algae after just a day or two. Families sometimes boiled it, but coal was expensive and many couldn't spare the fuel, so they drank it as it was, trusting that a strong stomach would be enough. The wealthy had options. They could buy bottled mineral water, imported beer or wine. Many preferred tea, which at least required boiling water, making it safer by accident. Alcohol, in fact, was often a safer bet than water. Beer, cider, and even diluted gin offered hydration without the same microbial risks. For the working classes, this meant that drinking beer for breakfast wasn't just cultural, it was practical. It might dull your senses, but it probably wouldn't kill you with cholera. Still, water was unavoidable. It was needed for cooking, for washing, for daily life, and every use carried risk. Mothers mixed baby formula with contaminated water. Street vendors sold lemonade or ginger beer, brewed with water that might have come straight from the river. Ice blocks imported from America or cut from local ponds carried their own microbial passengers. Even luxury wasn't free from danger. A fashionable dinner party might serve ices chilled with river ice, a detail you'd only notice later when half the guests were bedridden. The government eventually stepped in, but as with everything in the Victorian age, reform was slow and reactive. The Great Stink of 1858 finally forced Parliament's hand, leading to Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer System, a marvel of engineering that still forms the backbone of London sanitation today. Once the new system began diverting sewage away from the Thames, the water supply gradually improved. But for decades before that, every glass of water was a gamble, and it wasn't just London. Across Victorian Britain, shared wells, cisterns and pumps spread disease. In rural areas, animals often drank from the same water sources as people. In cities, industrial waste turned rivers unnatural shades. Bright blue from dyes, red from slaughterhouse runoff, black from coal tar. People joked that you could tell what colour fabric the mills were producing by the hue of the nearest stream. So when you imagine the Victorians sitting down for dinner, picture this. The bread might be fresh, the meat might be roasted, but the glass of water on the table carries more danger than the knife beside it. Every sip is a reminder that hygiene is not just about washing your hands or brushing your teeth. It's about the invisible world no one in this age quite understands. And when cholera strikes again, sweeping through the neighbourhood with brutal speed, you realise that the most terrifying thing about Victorian hygiene isn't the smell of the streets or the grease in the hair, it's the water. The one thing you cannot live without, the one thing that betrays you. By now you've noticed a pattern. The Victorian solution to filth wasn't usually to remove it, it was to cover it up, to disguise it, to smother it beneath something stronger. The laundry was aired, not scrubbed. The hair was powdered and greased, not washed. The streets were sprinkled with lime, not cleaned. And when it came to the human body and its surroundings, the ultimate shield was perfume. Not in the delicate, spritzed on the wrist way you're thinking, but in industrial strength doses that could knock out a mule. Perfume wasn't just fashion in the 19th century, it was survival. The smell of the Victorian city was overwhelming. Coal smoke, manure, human waste, rotting fish, and cabbage boiled into oblivion in tenement kitchens. Step outside and your nose was assaulted at every turn. Entering a crowded space, a theatre, a church, a railway carriage, was even worse. Hundreds of unwashed bodies packed together, sweating into wool and linen that hadn't seen soap in weeks. The solution? Perfume. Layers of it. So much that the air shimmered with competing scents, like dueling orchestras of lavender, musk, and vinegar. Smelling salts were the portable version of this defence system. Tiny vials, often kept in a lady's reticule or a gentleman's pocket, filled with ammonium carbonate crystals soaked in alcohol and scented oils. Crack open the stopper, take a sharp whiff, and your head cleared instantly, partly from the floral notes, mostly because the ammonia hit your sinuses like a slap. Smelling salts had been around for centuries, but in the Victorian era they became a fashionable accessory. Women were expected to faint occasionally, ideally in a graceful, socially acceptable swoon, and smelling salts were the quick fix to revive them. But salts weren't just for theatrics, they were practical. Walk through a market where fishmongers sold their catch from barrels of half-melted ice, and you'd want a dose of ammonia to cut through the stench. Visit a hospital ward where antisepsis was still optional, and the smell of pus and rot might send you diving into your salt bottle just to endure the air. Even funerals, often held in homes with the deceased laid out in the parlour for days, required frequent refreshing with strong scents. Perfume itself came in countless forms. There were scented waters like lavender water or rose water, splashed liberally on handkerchiefs and collars. There were oils infused with herbs and flowers, dabbed onto skin and hair. And there were solid pomanders, small containers filled with perfumed wax or spiced resins, carried in pockets or worn on chains. Some people stuffed orange peels with cloves and carried them to sniff in crowded streets. Think of it as the 19th century equivalent of walking around with a car air freshener pressed to your face. For women, perfumed accessories were a staple. Fans could be scented so that each flick of the wrist released a wave of fragrance into the air. Handkerchiefs were soaked in eau de cologne and pressed to the nose when the stench became unbearable. Corsages of fresh flowers weren't just decorative. They were portable air filters, meant to keep a small bubble of breathable space in a room filled with odours. Men too embraced the practice. Barbershops offered liberal applications of bay rum, a spicy alcoholic tonic splashed onto freshly shaved faces. Hair oils were often scented with bergamot, lavender or sandalwood, so that the natural smell of rancid fat or petroleum jelly was somewhat masked. Even tobacco smoke was considered a kind of deodorizer. A gentleman puffing a cigar in a foul-smelling alley wasn't just indulging in habit. He was creating a personal cloud of tolerable aroma. Of course, the line between perfume and medicine blurred constantly. In an age where miasma theory reigned supreme, foul smells weren't just unpleasant. They were thought to be deadly. Bad air equaled disease. Perfume, then, was not merely cosmetic. It was protective. A few drops of eau de cologne on your temple might keep you safe from cholera. A handkerchief soaked in vinegar and lavender could ward off typhus. Breathing through a sponge soaked in camphor was practically an act of public health. The irony, of course, is that none of it worked. The cholera bacillus didn't care how nice you smelled. Perfume couldn't kill germs it didn't know existed. But the placebo effect was powerful. People felt safer surrounded by clouds of lavender and citrus, and in a way that was its own kind of medicine. Still, the sheer volume of perfume could be staggering. Enter a Victorian drawing room during a gathering, and the air was thick with overlapping scents. Rosewater colliding with musk, lavender battling with patchouli, citrus fighting to rise above the musk of unwashed bodies. To the modern nose it would be overwhelming, even nauseating. But to Victorians this was the smell of refinement, the proof that civilization could rise above filth, even if it was just by covering it up. And here's where the humour of it all really lands. Imagine a Victorian couple on a walk by the Thames during the Great Stink. The river is belching up odours so vile they make headlines. What's their solution? Not avoiding the water, not demanding sanitation reform. No, they douse handkerchiefs in cologne, press them to their faces and soldier on, reeking of rose water while inhaling bacteria by the lungful. To be clean in this world was to smell like something other than what you actually were. Perfume became armour, smelling salts became shields, and yet beneath the lavender, the musk and the citrus, the reality of Victorian hygiene never really went away. You could mask the smell, but you couldn't escape it. Not when it lived in your clothes, your streets, your river, and your very water supply. So when you imagine the Victorians as prim and proper, all lace and restraint, remember this. Their refinement was built on layers of grease and coal smoke, stitched together with perfume strong enough to double as paint thinner. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then the Victorians worshipped with eau de cologne in one hand and a chamber pot in the other. You've survived the streets, you've sniffed your way through clouds of perfume, and now at the end of the day you're finally back in bed. The door is shut, the fire has burned down, and your chamber pot is safely tucked away under the commode. You pull up your heavy wool blanket, sink into the straw mattress and prepare for sleep. But you're not alone. Oh no. Because in the world of Victorian hygiene, the most consistent companions weren't family or neighbours. They were lice, and their close cousins, the bedbugs. Let's start with the lice, those tiny vampires that considered every scalp and every armpit fair game. Head lice were practically a given in Victorian society. Children passed them to each other in schools. Adults shared them through hats, brushes and clothing. Public transport, theatres, even churches. Anywhere people gathered, lice tagged along. And in an age when hair was rarely washed and clothing was rarely laundered, these creatures thrived like royalty. Body lice were even worse. Unlike head lice, they didn't cling to your hair. They lived in your clothes. They nestled in the seams of your undergarments, laying eggs in the very fabric you wore day after day. Imagine putting on your woolen undershirt, still damp from the previous wash 2 weeks ago, and feeling a faint tickle across your ribs. That's not the fabric brushing your skin. That's your house guests waking up for breakfast. Scratching was so universal that it barely raised eyebrows. It was as normal as coughing or yawning. People carried little combs or needles specifically for picking out lice eggs. Nits, from clothing seams or hair. Mothers sat children down by the fire and patiently combed through their scalps, cracking lice between fingernails as if it were no more remarkable than shelling peas. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the true tyrant of the night. These flat, rust-coloured insects hid in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the stitching of mattresses, and in the folds of sheets that hadn't been changed in weeks. During the day, they were invisible. At night, they crept out in armies, drawn by the heat of your body and the scent of your blood. Their bites left itchy welts that swelled and scabbed. You might wake to find faint trails of blood on your sheets, or the pepper-like droppings they left behind in mattress seams. And make no mistake, everyone had them. The poor, of course, suffered worst, crammed into damp tenements where mattresses were passed down from one family to the next, until they sagged under decades of sweat and insect life. But even the rich, with their silk sheets and canopy beds, weren't spared. Bedbugs didn't care how fine the linens were. They cared that humans were warm and immobile for 8 hours at a time. What did people do about it? Well, the war against these pests was waged with some truly questionable weapons. One method was scalding. Boil a kettle of water and pour it over the seams of your bed frame, hoping the steam would flush out the bugs. Another was fumigation, setting pans of burning sulphur or sprinkling mercury chloride around the room. The fumes killed bedbugs, and occasionally the humans too. Carbolic acid, kerosene, and even turpentine were pressed into service, filling bedrooms with a sharp stench of chemicals that lingered longer than the pests themselves. For lice, powders were common. Some were made from pyrethrum flowers, an early form of insecticide. Others used mercury-based ointments, which were highly toxic but widely trusted at the time. Vinegar rinses, kerosene rubs, even dustings of fine tobacco were suggested as treatments. If you survived the cure, you might also survive the infestation. The beds themselves became battlefields. Straw mattresses were regularly emptied, the straw burned, and the casings refilled. Feather mattresses, prized by the wealthy, were torn open and beaten in the sun, clouds of dust rising as bedbugs scattered in panic. Iron bedsteads began to replace wood in the mid-19th century, advertised as bug-proof, which was only partly true. Bugs simply learned to hide in the joints of the metal instead of the cracks in the wood. But perhaps the most Victorian solution of all was perfume. Yes, once again the answer was to drown the smell, not solve the problem. People sprinkled lavender, rosemary or camphor into mattresses, hoping to deter the insects with strong scents. It didn't work, of course, but at least the bed smelled less like sweat and more like a failed apothecary. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine lying in bed, exhausted from a day spent trudging through smoke and filth, only to feel the faint tickle of legs moving across your skin. You scratch, roll over, try to sleep. Minutes later, another bite, another itch. Whole families tossed and turned, blankets kicked aside, sleep broken not by noise but by the silent crawling army in their sheets. The morning sun revealed the damage. Little red bites on wrists, ankles and necks. And yet, everyone endured it. Because in this world, infestation wasn't unusual. It was expected. There were even sayings about it. To sleep tight wasn't about keeping sheets tucked snugly. It was a reminder to pull ropes tight on rope beds so the mattress didn't sag, making it harder for bedbugs to reach you. And "don't let the bedbugs bite" wasn't a cutesy rhyme. It was actual advice whispered with a mix of humour and resignation, because the bugs always did bite. In a way, the lice and bedbugs were the most democratic part of Victorian life. Disease targeted the poor disproportionately. Access to clean water was a privilege. But parasites didn't discriminate. They made their homes in the hair of children in both tenements and mansions, and they crawled through beds from slums to palaces. Everyone scratched. Everyone itched. Everyone carried the quiet shame of knowing their own body was someone else's habitat. And here's the kicker. They never really won the war. Even with better sanitation, even with new bedding materials, the pests endured. They always endure. The Victorians could perfume, scrub, scald and scratch, but the lice and the bedbugs held their ground. So when you picture a Victorian bedtime, a family gathered by the fire, a mother braiding her daughter's hair, a father reading a penny dreadful aloud, remember that the true story of the night began when the lights went out, when the scratching started, when the insects stirred, and when Victorian hygiene revealed its dirtiest truth of all, that even in sleep, you were never alone. You may think you've washed, powdered, perfumed, and survived the lice long enough to finally feel presentable in Victorian London. But there's one enemy you can't escape. No matter how much lavender water you splash on your neck, or how many layers of starch you press into your collars, it's not a bug, not a river, not even the chamber pot this time. It's the air itself. Because in the 19th century, you don't just breathe coal, you wear it. Every single day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you crawl back into your infested mattress, you're taking a bath in coal dust. Coal is the beating, sooty heart of the Industrial Revolution. It heats the homes, drives the steam engines, powers the factories, and boils the kettles. Without coal, Victorian life grinds to a halt. With coal, it never stops grinding at all. From the chimneys of townhouses to the towering stacks of textile mills, coal smoke billows day and night, thick enough to blot out the sun on bad days. You don't notice how pervasive it is until you leave the city and realise that clean air smells like a different planet. The dust settles on everything. Windows are never really transparent. Curtains fade to grey in a matter of weeks. Freshly laundered shirts develop a faint shadow around the collar after a single outing. Even inside, the layer of soot creeps under doorways, sifts through cracks, and collects in fine drifts across shelves and mantels. Housewives wage daily battles with rags and brushes, knowing full well the dust will return within hours, and then there's your body. By midday, your hands look as if you've been stoking a furnace, even if all you did was walk to work. Your face takes on a faint grey sheen. Your hair grows heavier with particles clinging to the grease and pomade. If you lick your lips in the street, you taste it, a dry, bitter grit that crunches faintly between your teeth. Your nostrils fill with black residue that you blow out in startling streaks when you find a handkerchief. It's not impolite, it's survival. Everyone's handkerchief is streaked with soot. Coal dust doesn't just sit politely on the surface of things, it infiltrates lungs. Children cough through the night, their throats roar from breathing particles small enough to slip past the body's defences. Adults wake with a heaviness in the chest that never quite goes away. Miners, of course, suffer the worst, black lung filling their bodies with slow, suffocating poison. But even those who never see the inside of a mine still carry the city's coal inside them. Every Victorian Londoner is, in some sense, part coal by weight. The smell is another matter entirely. Coal smoke has a sweet, sulphurous tang that hangs in the back of your throat. At first, it's just unpleasant. After weeks, it becomes background. After years, it becomes part of you. The scent clings to your clothes so thoroughly that even country inns know instantly when a guest has come from the city. It's in your wool coat, your hat, your boots, your very skin. It's the Victorian equivalent of carrying your hometown accent, only this one is olfactory and inescapable. Of course, the city's residents try to fight back. Windows are stuffed with fabric to block the soot. Water is splashed across doorsteps to keep dust down, but nothing works for long. The sheer volume of coal burned each day is staggering. By the mid-19th century, London alone consumed millions of tons annually, more than any other city in the world. Each ton meant more smoke, more soot, more dust drifting lazily into the lungs of everyone unlucky enough to be breathing nearby. And remember, all this is happening before anyone connects air quality to long-term health. The idea that smoke might kill you slowly is not yet accepted. Smoke is seen as the smell of progress, the perfume of industry. If the air is thick and black, it means factories are running, trains are moving, the empire is alive and humming. Complaining about coal dust is a bit like complaining about money. You sound ungrateful, even if you're coughing up black phlegm every morning, but the evidence is everywhere. Curtains, as mentioned, don't just fade, they disintegrate, fibres eaten away by constant exposure to soot. Books left on shelves develop a fine grey coating across the top edge of their pages. Even food is affected. Loaves of bread left uncovered in shops quickly gather a dusting, as though someone sprinkled charcoal over them. Milk develops a skin not just from the cream rising to the top, but from particles that are floated in during transport. The Victorian diet always comes with a side of coal. And then there's the fog, or rather the smog, a word born in this age, when smoke and fog blended into a choking blanket that rolled through the streets. On bad days, you can't see a few feet in front of you. Cab drivers grope their way along familiar routes. Pedestrians stumble into each other, handkerchiefs pressed desperately to their faces. The fog dampens sound, muffling footsteps and carriage wheels until the city feels ghostly. But the smell gives it away. This isn't natural mist, it's smoke, sulphur, soot, and water vapour holding hands and choking you all at once. The wealthy do what they can. Drawing rooms are outfitted with extra curtains, sometimes doubled or tripled to block soot. Housekeepers wage endless campaigns with feather dusters and polishing cloths. Perfume bottles multiply, as though lavender water could defeat sulphur. Some homes even line walls with glazed tiles, easier to wipe down than wallpaper, though the tiles themselves soon dull beneath a film of grey. But the truth is universal. No one escapes the coal bath. And if you were to step back and look at the city from above, the effect would be unmistakable. Roofs coated in soot, chimneys vomiting smoke, streets streaked black from rain washing down coal dust into gutters. The Thames itself, sluggish and dark, reflected not the sky but the haze. In a sense, the city was constantly painting itself darker, each chimney stroke adding another layer. For you, as an ordinary Victorian, coal dust is simply part of existence. You sleep in it, breathe it, taste it, sweat it out. It sticks to your collar, it lines your nostrils, it rests on your tongue. It is the invisible bath you take every single day, whether you want to or not. And unlike the weekly ordeal in the tin tub, there is no escape, no towel, no moment of true freshness. Only the constant, quiet reality that you're slowly being embalmed in soot, one breath at a time. You've already endured the coal dust in the air clinging to your hair and choking your lungs. But now it's time to look down, and that's when you realise the Victorian city has another problem, one that's far less subtle than the invisible bath of soot. The streets themselves are alive with filth, and the main culprit isn't sewage pipes or chamber pots this time, it's horses. Thousands upon thousands of horses. For every person in the city, there seems to be at least one hoof clattering nearby. Horses are everywhere, pulling carriages, hauling coal wagons, dragging omnibuses packed with commuters. Without them, London and every major Victorian city would grind to a halt. But horses come with certain biological realities. On average, each animal produces 20 to 30 pounds of manure per day, plus several quarts of urine. Multiply that by the tens of thousands of horses working the streets of London, and you're left with an astonishing mountain of muck piling up day after day. It doesn't just sit neatly in piles either. Hooves and wagon wheels crush it into the cobblestones, grinding it into a brown, sticky paste. When it rains, the manure dissolves into slurry, turning entire streets into slippery, reeking rivers. In dry weather, it hardens into dust, carried into the air by passing carriages. That dust doesn't just coat your boots, it drifts into your lungs, your food, your bedding. Every bite of bread sold at a corner stall comes with a seasoning of powdered horse droppings. And don't forget the flies. Manure draws them in droves, buzzing clouds that swarm through markets, kitchens and homes. They feast, they breed, and then they carry whatever diseases they've picked up straight into your dinner. One Victorian health reformer noted grimly that flies were the most active scavengers of the metropolis, moving effortlessly between latrines, dung heaps and your buttered toast. Street cleaners fought a losing war. Armed with brooms, shovels and carts, they moved constantly through the city, scraping up the worst of the mess and carting it away. But the scale of the problem was overwhelming. For every pile shoveled, another two appeared. Horses didn't stop for convenience. They relieved themselves mid-stride in markets, in front of churches, outside theatres. You might leave home in polished boots, but by the time you reached your destination, the soles were caked with a layer of grime thick enough to leave tracks indoors. Some of the manure was actually valuable. Farmers outside the city bought cartloads of it for fertiliser, and entire trades sprang up around transporting the stuff. Barges carried manure down the Thames, wagons hauled it to the countryside, and deals were struck between city authorities and farmers desperate for cheap enrichment for their fields. But supply far outstripped demand. London alone produced an estimated 1,000 tonnes of horse manure per day in the 1890s. No amount of farmland could absorb that much fertiliser. As the piles grew, so did the public outcry. In the 1890s, the Times of London famously predicted that by the mid-20th century, city streets would be buried 9 feet deep in manure if nothing changed. It was called the manure crisis, a problem so vast it seemed unsolvable. And remember, this was before cars. No one yet imagined an alternative. The horse was the engine of the city, and it was literally drowning its streets in waste. For ordinary pedestrians, the problem was immediate and personal. Imagine stepping out in your best boots, navigating cobblestones slick with a film of brown sludge. Carriages splash it onto your trousers as they pass. Crossing sweepers, usually children employed to clear a small patch of road for paying customers, dart ahead, brushing a path with their brooms in exchange for a penny. Step carefully, or your hem will be ruined for weeks. And then there's the smell. Ammonia rises from fresh urine, sharp enough to sting your nose. Piles of manure ferment in the sun, releasing a heavy, sour stench that blends with the background fog of coal smoke and human sweat. On hot summer days, the city becomes a stew of odours, every street corner a reminder that progress has a smell, and it isn't lavender water. The danger isn't just olfactory. Manure piles become breeding grounds for disease. Typhoid, dysentery and cholera all find comfortable homes in the filth. Children playing in the streets track it back into their homes, onto their bedding, into their food. The manure problem is more than an inconvenience. It's a health crisis with legs and wings and sometimes teeth if you count the rats that thrive alongside it. Attempts at solutions were creative, if not always effective. Some reformers suggested limiting the number of horses in the city, a laughable idea in a world where they were the backbone of commerce. Others pushed for more efficient street cleaning, more carts, more sweepers. But the tide of filth never really stopped. Even manure auctions sprang up, where heaps were sold to the highest bidder, as though the problem could simply be transferred from one set of shoulders to another. Meanwhile, pedestrians developed their own strategies. Men lifted their trouser legs high when crossing especially foul patches. Women clutched skirts tightly to avoid dragging the fabric through muck. Boots were designed with thicker soles to survive constant scrubbing. Some even wore overshoes that could be removed upon entering a building, leaving the street filth behind at the door. Crossing sweepers became minor heroes, carving tiny islands of cleanliness in an endless sea of waste. And yet, for all the ingenuity, the problem persisted. Every horse on every street left its mark. Every wheel ground the manure deeper into the city's fabric. Every dry gust carried the dust into someone's lungs. The manure crisis remained the unspoken background to Victorian life, not as dramatic as cholera, not as infamous as the Great Stink, but constant, grinding and inescapable. So when you imagine a Victorian boulevard lined with gas lamps and bustling with finely dressed men and women, remember to picture what lay underfoot. The elegant gowns brushing the ground weren't just sweeping cobblestones, they were sweeping manure. The polished boots of statesmen and clerks weren't polished for long, and every child running barefoot through the street carried a reminder of the city's greatest unsolved problem between their toes. The horse gave the Victorians mobility, speed, power, but it also gave them a never-ending avalanche of filth, and in the end, it wasn't sanitation reform or better street cleaning that solved the manure crisis. It was the arrival of the automobile, a noisy, dangerous, smelly invention in its own right, but one that at least replaced 1,000 tons of horse manure with something a bit more combustible. You've spent the morning dodging manure piles and coal dust, and now your stomach growls. Time for a bite to eat. But in Victorian London, grabbing street food doesn't mean artisanal sandwiches or trendy food trucks. It means approaching one of the countless vendors who line the streets, balancing trays, baskets, or barrows piled high with things they swear are edible. You want something cheap, quick, and filling. What you actually get is a microbial tour of the city's hygiene failures. Street vending was the backbone of Victorian urban dining. Not everyone could afford to cook at home, especially the poor living in one-room lodgings with no hearth of their own. Workers needed food on the go, children ran errands with pennies, and travellers grabbed sustenance between carriages. The streets were filled with vendors shouting their wares: pies, oysters, eels, hot potatoes, fried fish, roasted chestnuts, gingerbread, and penny ices. It sounded abundant, even festive. But underneath the cheerful cries and clattering trays lurked the reality. Almost none of it was safe. Start with the oysters. In the 19th century, oysters weren't a luxury food. They were cheap, plentiful, and eaten by the working class in staggering quantities. Street stalls sold them raw, straight from the shell at a penny a dozen. They were harvested from rivers and estuaries all around London, the same rivers and estuaries into which sewers emptied their fragrant contents. Imagine slurping down a briny oyster, unaware that its last meal was sewage from tenements upstream. Food poisoning was rampant, and outbreaks of cholera were often linked directly to contaminated shellfish. Then there were the pies. Every vendor had a tray of hot meat pies, their golden crusts puffed up, their filling steaming. But what was inside? That was the mystery. Meat was expensive and vendors rarely wasted prime cuts on the poor. Instead, pies were stuffed with scraps, gristle, organs or meat, so old it was green before being disguised under layers of pepper and pastry. Sometimes cats and dogs found their way into the mix. The saying 4 blackbirds baked in a pie might sound whimsical, but in Victorian London 4 pigeons wasn't out of the question. The crusts weren't just flaky, they were camouflage. Fried fish was another favourite. Vendors carried trays with slabs of battered fish fried in oil sold by the slice. The problem wasn't the fish itself, but the oil. Frying oil was expensive, so it was reused endlessly, growing darker and thicker until it smoked heavily even at low heat. The smell of rancid oil clung to the air around fish stalls, a haze of grease that coated everything in reach. If you bit into a piece of fried fish, you weren't just eating fish, you were eating the ghosts of every fish that had been fried in that same oil for the past month. And then there were the sweets. Children clamoured for gingerbread, boiled sugar drops and penny ices. The gingerbread was often made in bulk, stored in damp conditions until mould spotted the surface, then refreshed with a new layer of sugar glaze. Penny ices, the Victorian version of ice cream, were made with questionable water, flavoured with dubious syrups, and served in glasses reused by dozens of children in a row. The vendor wiped the glass with a dirty rag between customers, then handed it to the next eager child. A penny bought not just a sweet treat, but a sampling of every germ carried by the neighbourhood. Street drinks were no better. Lemonade and ginger beer were brewed in barrels, ladled into cups and passed around. The water came from the nearest pump, often shared by dozens of households, often contaminated. Vendors sometimes stretched their drinks with alum or chalk to make them look cloudier and more authentic. Others spiked ginger beer with small amounts of alcohol, which at least killed some microbes but also meant children stumbled home tipsy. If the food itself wasn't enough of a gamble, the way it was sold sealed the deal. Vendors carried their wares uncovered, exposed to the constant rain of soot, dust and flies. Trays of pies balanced on heads picked up coal flakes from the air. Open baskets of bread absorbed the smell of horse manure from the street. Flies, fat from feasting on dung heaps, landed freely on sweets and fish alike. And remember, most vendors had no access to clean water for washing hands, knives or utensils. A rag tucked into a waistband served as a universal cleaning tool, used to wipe sweat, wipe knives, and polish off glasses. The Victorians knew, at least dimly, that street food was risky. Satirical magazines mocked it constantly, printing cartoons of suspicious pies and dodgy oysters. Health reformers wrote reports about the poisons sold upon our streets, but hunger won out over caution. When you worked 12 hours in a factory, a hot pie or a roasted potato from a street corner was often the only hot meal you could afford. And when your children begged for sweets, you handed over the penny, knowing full well the sugar came with a side of typhoid. Even the middle class wasn't immune. They might look down on street food, but they too bought roasted chestnuts in winter or ices in summer. Novelty trumped caution. After all, illness was so common that one more bout of diarrhea barely stood out. The government made half-hearted attempts at regulation. Inspectors occasionally cracked down on the most egregious cases. The pie seller caught stuffing his wares with diseased horse meat, the oyster stall that reeked too strongly of sewage to ignore. But enforcement was sporadic, and most people knew how to bribe an inspector or move to a new street corner if things got too hot. So you ate, and you hoped. You swallowed your oyster, crunched through your greasy pie, licked your penny ice, and prayed that this time your stomach would hold. And when it didn't, when you found yourself doubled over hours later, you cursed the vendor, swore you'd never eat street food again, and then bought another pie the very next day, because hunger doesn't care about sanitation reports. Street food in the Victorian city wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble. Every bite carried the risk of sickness, every drink the risk of disease, but it was cheap, it was hot, and it was there. And for millions of Victorians, that was enough. Now the story pivots, quietly at first, like a door creaking in a hospital corridor. The thing that will eventually clean this world is not stronger perfume, not deeper gutters, and not better manners. It is an idea. Unfortunately, ideas are invisible, and the Victorian public prefers visible solutions. Lime sprinkled on a doorstep is visible. So is a new iron urinal. A theory about creatures too small to see, hitchhiking in water and air, feels like a practical joke told by someone who has never tried to scrub a collar. You have to understand the intellectual weather of the time. For centuries, people believed that stench itself caused disease. Bad air equaled bad outcomes. The logic was simple and seductive. If cholera arrives with a foul odour, then the odour must be the culprit. If a fever ward reeks, the smell must be the cause, not the symptom. Whole cities planned their sanitation around this belief. Streets were deodorized, rooms were fumigated, curtains were soaked in vinegar, and people pressed citrus oil to their nostrils as if a lemon were a shield. You have lived inside that thinking for the last several episodes, and you have watched it fail with heroic consistency. Then, in a series of experiments and tragedies, a new pattern surfaces. Food that spoils does so with a swarm of tiny life. Wine that turns does so when something living gets inside. Meat that rots does not do it by magic. It does it when the air or a fly or a dirty knife delivers a cargo of living things. A French chemist shows that broth sealed from air and boiled stays sweet. while broth allowed to breathe grows haze and scum. He says life comes from life, not from nothing. A Scottish surgeon in a smoky city hears that idea and asks a blunt question. If tiny life spoils wine, could tiny life spoil wounds? He soaks dressings in a coal tar derivative that smells like a railway station, clamps his nose against the sting, and watches infection rates in his ward fall like a dropped stone. Amputations that once failed reliably now survive more often. He tells everyone to clean their hands, boil their instruments, and splash the room with the sharp medicinal scent of phenol. An empire of surgeons rolls its collective eyes, then tries it, then quietly claims they were on board the whole time. Hospitals are the grim classroom where the new idea fights the old. Walk with your nose. The ward is warmer than the street, but not kinder. The air is heavy with sweat, carbolic, and the sweet metallic note of blood. For centuries, a busy surgeon wore a coat that advertised experience by how stiff it had become with dried fluids. The coat was called Good Luck. Apprentices watched and learned while the coat shed flakes. Between operations, hands were wiped on a communal towel. Instruments were rinsed if time allowed. Beds were overcrowded. Pus was expected. A good outcome was almost a surprise. In the 1860s and 1870s, that begins to change. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in enough places that numbers start to shift. Boiled tools, fresh dressings, hands scrubbed until the skin burns. Mortality after major operations creeps downward. Clean is no longer a fragrance, it is a method. Outside the hospital, the new idea stalks the water pump. A London doctor maps deaths on a neighbourhood street and finds a pattern so tight even the sceptical feel their eyebrows rise. Remove a handle, stop an outbreak. It is not the air that kills, it is the cup. This is not yet the final victory, because people still argue about mechanisms and pride as a powerful illness, but the map looks back at the city like a mirror. If the pump can kill, then the pipe can kill, and the river can kill. You do not need to smell death to drink it. City government moves like an overloaded wagon on wet cobbles, but it moves. Laws consolidate past measures under larger public health acts. Inspectors gain more authority to force sanitary reforms. The new sewer network unfurls under the streets, huge brick tunnels that curve like ribs beneath the metropolis. Waste is captured and sent away from intake points for drinking water. The effect is measurable even to those who distrust new theories. Fewer outbreaks, cleaner wharves. The river still looks like boiled tea on a bad day, and dead dogs still drift where they should not. But the trajectory changes direction. Statistics, once a dull hobby, become headlines. Resistance persists, because resistance always does. People do not like to be told that their hands are traitors. They do not like to hear that a clean-smelling room can still kill the guest who sleeps in it. Merchants whose profits depend on the old ways call the new practices expensive fads. Some physicians resent the suggestion that their tradition needs soap. Midwives and doctors argue about childbirth fever and whose hands carry what. You can hear pride in the corners of the wards, a brittle scraping sound that does not yield easily to data. Even language gets in the way. Bad air is easy to say. Germ is newer and strange on the tongue. You can point at a cesspit. You cannot point at a microbe unless you own the newest instruments, and even then the image is a ghostly oval that looks like something from a child's sketchbook. You're being asked to change behaviour based on creatures that do not announce themselves at the door. The mind clings to what it can smell. Still, improvements prove stubborn. Soap production grows and refines, and cheaper bars move through markets and into homes. Carbolic soaps appear on counters and in advertisements, selling a mix of reality and reassurance. Municipal baths expand by decade, imperfect but available. The pay toilet that promised a towel and a flush becomes less a spectacle and more a model. Water companies are pushed further upstream to draw from cleaner reaches, and filtration with sand beds becomes standard rather than novelty. A map of infant deaths begins to lighten in neighbourhoods, where new pipes and better drains arrive. A slow victory is still a victory. Factories change too, not because of kindness, but because of calculation. Absenteeism falls when workers do not share cholera. Insurance costs shift as employers tinker with ventilation, drains and washrooms. A limitation on hours for women and children in mills is framed as morality, but it also narrows the window for disease to spread. Regulations about slaughterhouses and tanneries move stinking industries away from dense housing. It is not perfect, it is not pure, but fewer people die in clusters just because a breeze changes direction. Education becomes a hygiene tool, sharpened awkwardly at first, then with more skill. Pamphlets teach boiling water. Posters show hands under taps that finally exist. School lessons include the idea that tiny life exists and that it is not always your friend. Mothers who once hung damp curtains to fight miasma now watch for the colour of the water, and some even refuse street drinks that arrive in a glass wiped with a rag older than the booth itself. Tea drinking, already a national habit, turns out to be science by accident, and kettles whistle like tiny public health officials on every stove. There are theatrical moments too. A demonstration with a spray of dye shows how far droplets travel when someone coughs across a room. A jar of clear water becomes cloudy under a lens when touched by a dirty finger. A pig carcass hung over a market drips on a scale, and inspectors finally shut the place down. Newspapers discover that diagrams sell, and the public discovers that a picture of a pipe can be as thrilling as a scandal if the pipe carries the city's future. You still live in a world of lice and coal dust, of course. Parasites did not read the journals. Smog did not retreat just because surgeons started boiling things. Bedbugs are winning their private war inside the hems of mattresses you would rather burn than beat. But the curve of knowledge bends. Those who laughed at the smell of carbolic stop laughing when the neighbour with the same cut dies, and their relative does not. A nurse who once counted her experience in stains begins to count it in clean hands. The word sterilise joins the language of the ward. The word aseptic follows. The coat of dried luck quietly disappears from the hanger. The new idea leaks into habits in small ways that add up. You resist the urge to dip a shared cup at a public fountain, and you bring your own mug instead. You notice the colour of a shopkeeper's cutting board, and you choose a loaf that has not sat under an open window full of dust. You boil the baby's bottle, even when coal costs bite into the week's food money, because you have started to believe that heat can fix what sight cannot see. These are not dramatic moments. They are a slow migration of daily choices from charm to caution, from scent to method. By the late century, laboratories named culprits that once hid behind euphemism. The microbe that ruins lungs, the one that inflames bowels, the one that burns throats, each gets a face on a slide and a name in a book. Rules for proving a given organism causes a given disease are laid out and repeated until even skeptics start to run the checklist. Vaccines step into the room, tentative but brave. Antisepsis evolves toward asepsis, from killing contamination after it arrives to refusing to let it in the door. White coats replace lucky coats, not because white is fashionable, but because it betrays dirt instantly. The city above ground becomes a little less theatrical about smell. The perfume bottle does not retire, but it is demoted. Handkerchiefs soaked in lavender are still flourished in theatres, but more windows are opened, more drains are trapped, more pipes are sealed against the backflow of a river that once nursed epidemics in its arms. The word filth remains, but it begins to move from a moral judgment to a material category. Filth is not a sin. Filth is a vector. You cannot confess it away. You can only remove it. All of this arrives too slowly for plenty of people who deserved it earlier. Many die before the new habits become dull. Many cling to the old ones and pay the price. Superstition lives a long time because superstition is warm and science is often cold. You can cuddle a belief. You cannot cuddle a table of data, yet the data keeps arriving. Death curves bend down after sewer connections open. Fever wards empty a little faster when surgeons wash. Birth beds that once claimed mothers with clockwork cruelty release more of them to hold their babies in the morning light. This is not romance. This is plumbing and discipline and soap. What you learn, standing at the hinge of the 19th century, is that cleanliness is a choreography of the unseen. The cloth laid over the mouth during surgery is not a decoration. The sealed jar of milk is not a snob's affectation. The bar of soap with an acrid hospital smell is not a luxury. These are tiny walls built against an army you cannot see, and the walls work. So you find yourself doing strange things that would have looked absurd to your grandparents. You let water run clear before you fill a kettle. You prefer food that has met real heat to food that only pretends to be fresh. You notice when the bathhouse replaces its wooden tubs with glazed ones that are easier to scrub. You watch for the sign that says filtered, and if a vendor laughs at the word, you keep walking. Your nose still matters in this city of smells, but now your eyes and your hands and your patience matter more. The joke of the age is that the Victorians spent decades trying to banish stench, only to learn that the real monsters had no odour at all. The lesson of the age is that once the invisible is named, you can change the visible world to block it. The room is still warm with coal and crowded with sweat. The bed is still a brave place at night. The streets still shine for the wrong reasons after rain. But there is a new muscle in the culture. A willingness to wash what does not look dirty. A willingness to boil what looks perfectly fine. A willingness to trust numbers over noses. You fall asleep with that thought, and for once the city feels slightly kinder. Not because it smells better, although sometimes it does, but because knowledge has moved in with its small suitcase of rituals. Tomorrow will still require a chamber pot and a stiff brush, and a careful step over a suspicious puddle. Yet there is now a quiet line running through the day. Wash first, boil first, cover first. Laugh at superstition in private if you must, then do the sanitary thing anyway. Clean is no longer the absence of smell. Clean is a set of habits. Clean is a plan. Clean is a future that hesitates, then arrives, still wearing coal dust on its boots, but carrying a bar of soap and a map of the water mains like they are sacred texts. And for the first time in this series you can breathe in a room that smells faintly of phenol and think, yes, this sting in my nose is not romance, but it is relief. By now you've breathed coal dust, you've tasted horse manure in the air, and you've eaten street food with a side of cholera. Surely, you think, there must be one realm of Victorian life where people could at least keep themselves a little cleaner. Maybe in something as intimate, as personal, as the clothes closest to the body. Surely underwear, that humble barrier between human skin and the world, offered a last line of defence. But no, the story of Victorian undergarments is not one of cleanliness. It is one of compromise, discomfort, and occasional outright surrender. Start with the basics. The average Victorian didn't own a wardrobe stuffed with outfits. Clothing was expensive. For the working class, a single set of outer clothes had to serve for work, church, and social life. The thing that saved those precious garments from dissolving into a sweat-stained mess was underwear. Not sexy underwear, not the delicate lace and silk that graced fashion plates. No, long, shapeless layers of linen, cotton or wool designed not to flatter but to absorb. For men, the standard was the shirt. Unlike today, the shirt was considered underwear. The layer worn next to the skin, tucked into trousers, and covered with a waistcoat and jacket. It absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the more expensive outer layers from frequent washing. Because shirts were considered undergarments, it was considered indecent for a man to be seen in shirt sleeves. That's right. What you think of as formal dress, they thought of as standing around in your underwear. For women, things grew even more complicated. A typical outfit might include a chemise, drawers, stays or corset, petticoats, and finally the dress itself. Each layer had a role. The chemise, a loose linen or cotton shift, was the foundation, the piece that soaked up sweat, much like the man's shirt. Drawers, essentially long shorts, often open at the crotch, were increasingly popular by mid-century but not universal. Yes, you heard that right. Many Victorian women went without underwear on the bottom half altogether. Petticoats added volume and warmth. Corsets shaped the torso, though contrary to myth, They weren't always laced to suffocating extremes, and all of it together created an ensemble that trapped heat, trapped odours, and ensured that a single gust of summer wind could turn you into a human steam room. Now imagine washing all those layers. The chemise might be laundered weekly, if water and coal were available, since it was relatively cheap fabric. Drawers too, if you had them, went into the wash more often, but the rest. Corsets, petticoats, and dresses were washed infrequently, sometimes not at all, because the materials were too delicate, or the dyes too expensive to risk. Instead, they were brushed, sponged, and aired, which meant that underwear carried an enormous burden. It wasn't just clothing, it was armour, absorbing sweat, dirt, and dead skin so that the outer garments could remain socially acceptable, and armour it was, in more ways than one. Woolen undergarments were promoted as healthful, said to keep the body warm and ward off disease. The sanitary woolen system, advocated by reformers, encouraged wearing thick wool underwear year-round, even in summer. Imagine sweltering in August, encased in wool, perspiring freely with no deodorant and no shower waiting at home. The smell was not so much masked as baked into the fabric. Drawers, when worn, deserve their own mention. They often came in two halves joined at the waist, with a gap in the middle to allow for answering nature's call, without the inconvenience of removing layers of skirts or petticoats. Practical, yes. Hygienic? Debatable. The design allowed plenty of air circulation, which Victorians thought healthy, but also provided easy access for lice, dirt and drafts. Hygiene was relative. Comfort was questionable. But in a society obsessed with appearances, practicality often won over cleanliness. Men's undergarments weren't much better. Wool flannel drawers and undershirts were recommended by doctors, who swore they prevented colds and chills. In practice, they trapped sweat and provided a perfect breeding ground for body lice. Changing them required more laundry, more soap, more coal. So many simply didn't. A man might wear the same flannel shirt for weeks, scraping the surface with a brush and declaring it fresh enough. By the end, the shirt could practically stand on its own. And then there's the question of smell. Linen and cotton absorbed sweat, but they didn't neutralize it. They carried it. A freshly laundered chemise might smell faintly of lye soap and coal smoke. A chemise worn 3 days in July smelled like a damp cave filled with onions. The human body produces odours naturally, but the Victorian layering system guaranteed those odours were trapped, stewed, and then released in slow bursts throughout the day. No amount of perfume or lavender sachets could fully disguise it. The social rules around underwear made the situation even more absurd. Because shirts were technically undergarments, men in shirt sleeves were considered improperly dressed in public. It was the 19th century equivalent of wandering around in your boxer shorts. Women, meanwhile, were expected to be paragons of modesty. Yet the open-crotch drawers common in the mid-century would shock a modern audience with their bold ventilation. The Victorians were nothing if not consistent in their contradictions. And let's not forget beds. Remember those lice and bedbugs? They thrived in underwear too. Underclothes doubled as nightwear since most people didn't own separate pyjamas. You slept in the same chemise or shirt you wore during the day, sweating into it through the night, and then you wore it again the next morning. Laundering was rare, changing even rarer. Clothing wasn't just a shield between you and the outside world. It was a record of your bodily existence, worn, reworn, and only occasionally reset by the ritual of wash day. The wealthy fared slightly better, with multiple sets of undergarments and servants to launder them. Fine cottons and silks offered more comfort, though not necessarily more hygiene. Silk drawers might look elegant, but they were just as prone to harbouring odours and pests as wool, and even the rich couldn't escape the fact that changing clothes still meant hauling, boiling, and scrubbing. Laundry day was universal misery, regardless of fabric quality. So underwear in the Victorian age wasn't the crisp, clean secret beneath the outerwear. It was the sponge that absorbed the grime of daily life. It was the compromise between propriety and practicality, modesty and necessity. Sometimes it was absent altogether, and when it was present it often carried its own host of problems. The next time you see a Victorian portrait, remember this. Behind the polished waistcoat or the immaculate gown, there was always a layer of underwear doing silent, filthy battle. It might have been wool, linen, or silk. It might have been washed last week or last month. It might have been crawling with tiny cohabitants. But whatever it was the closest thing the Victorians had to hygiene, and it was never close enough. You have tolerated chamber pots, coal dust, lice, and the open crotch undergarments of Victorian daily life. But now comes the horror that sits inside your very mouth: dentistry. Because if Victorian hygiene was questionable at the best of times, dental hygiene was a full-scale disaster. The mouth was both battlefield and graveyard, and a trip to the dentist was less routine checkup and more voluntary assault. Start with prevention, or rather the lack of it. Toothbrushes existed, but they were crude. Handles were carved from bone or wood, and the bristles were stiff animal hair that frayed quickly and harboured bacteria. If you were lucky, your brush had boar bristles. If not, it was horsehair or pig hair, each one with a faint barnyard tang that didn't vanish no matter how much you rinsed. Toothpaste, as you think of it today, didn't exist. Instead, there were powders, chalk, crushed seashells, soot or brick dust. Yes, brick dust. A cheap abrasive that could scrub plaque but also grind enamel down until your teeth were more fragile than ever. Imagine scouring your teeth with sandpaper every morning. That was dental care. And many people didn't bother at all. Teeth were low priority compared to survival. Bread was coarse, sweeteners were unrefined, and diets were often rich in sugar for those who could afford it, especially once cheap imported sugar from Caribbean plantations flooded the market. This meant cavities were rampant. Blackened, aching teeth were as common as coal soot in the lungs. Breath was rarely fresh. In fact, halitosis was so normalised that perfume lozenges were sold in apothecaries to mask it, a minty attempt to cover what brushing never really solved. When prevention failed, and it always failed, you went to the dentist. But dentist was a loose term. Some were trained surgeons or doctors branching into teeth as a specialty. Others were barbers who moonlighted with pliers. Street tooth pullers operated at fairs, yanking teeth in public as a spectacle, the victim shrieking while the crowd cheered. The line between entertainment and medicine blurred in a way that would make your gums ache just hearing about it. Step into a Victorian dental office, and the first thing you notice is the smell. A thick, cloying mix of carbolic acid, alcohol, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. The air is heavy and humid, curtains drawn against coal dust but trapping the odours of infection inside. Instruments are lined neatly on a table. Steel pliers, chisels, scrapers, each one clean only in the visual sense. Sterilisation wasn't widely practised until late in the century, so clean often meant wiping the instrument on a rag between patients. That rag might have seen more mouths than a tavern glass. The chair is not designed for comfort. It is upright, wooden, with armrests you can grip while the dentist goes to work. An assistant might be present to hold your head steady. Anaesthetic options are minimal. Laughing gas, nitrous oxide, had been discovered in the early 19th century, but it was not widely available in dental offices until later in the century. Ether and chloroform were used in surgeries, but dentists were often reluctant to employ them for something as simple as an extraction. The usual method of pain relief was alcohol, for both patient and practitioner. A stiff drink before the procedure numbed your nerves, and a stiff drink after calmed the shakes. Extraction was the go-to solution for any dental problem. Toothache, pull it. Abscess, pull it. Crooked, pull it. Teeth were considered disposable, and the goal was not preservation but elimination of pain. Unfortunately, extraction was quick only when it worked the first time. More often, teeth broke under the pliers, roots splintered, and the dentist had to chisel and dig. The sound of scraping echoed through your skull. The pressure radiated down your jaw, and without anaesthesia, you felt every nerve screaming. Fillings existed but were rare. Early fillings were made of gold, tin, or even lead. Yes, lead. dentists packed cavities with soft metal, which hardened and offered temporary relief until the filling loosened, fell out, or poisoned you slowly. Porcelain fillings were developed later, but they were expensive luxuries. For the average Victorian, the idea of preserving a decayed tooth was laughable. You either lived with the pain or endured the pliers. False teeth were another booming industry, especially for the wealthy. Ivory was common, carved into plates and fitted awkwardly into the mouth. They stained easily, cracked under pressure, and absorbed odours until your breath smelled faintly of dead elephant. Human teeth were also in demand. Known as Waterloo teeth, they were scavenged from battlefields or bought from grave robbers, polished and mounted into dentures. The irony of wearing another man's molars while sipping tea in your parlour was not lost on satirists of the time. Later, vulcanized rubber revolutionized dentures, providing a cheaper, more durable base. But no matter the material, dentures were never truly comfortable. They pinched, slipped, and clicked audibly during meals. The culture of dentistry was brutal because the expectation of pain was universal. People feared toothaches as much as they feared surgery. A swollen jaw meant sleepless nights, poultices of mustard or vinegar pressed against the skin, prayers muttered that the pain would ease. When it didn't, you dragged yourself to the dentist, knowing you would walk out bleeding, shaking, but relieved that at least one enemy had been evicted from your mouth. The wealthy could afford regular dental visits, but they too suffered. Caries didn't care about class. Aristocrats with access to sugar-rich diets often had worse teeth than peasants who lived on coarse bread and gruel. Portraits might show elegant smiles, but behind the canvas lay a reality of rotting gums and missing molars. Some wore closed lip expressions not out of modesty, but to hide the battlefield inside their mouths. Children fared no better. Milk teeth decayed quickly, and extractions were common even for the very young. A child might endure the pliers before reaching double digits, leaving gaps that shifted the growth of adult teeth. No braces awaited them, only the promise of crooked smiles and the eventual salvation of dentures. By the late century, things began to shift. Professional dental schools opened, standardizing training. Fluoride was still decades away, but better brushes and milder powders appeared. Carbolic and antiseptic practices slowly reduced infection. Nitrous oxide spread as an anesthetic, offering at last some escape from the raw brutality of earlier extractions. Still, for most Victorians, the experience of dentistry remained one of endurance. The smell of blood and carbolic, the grip of wooden armrests, the sound of pliers grinding against bone, these were the defining features of Victorian dental care. So when you imagine the refined smiles of the Victorian elite, remember this. Behind every grin was a history of chalk dust brushing, lead fillings, ivory plates, and public tooth-pulling spectacles. A Victorian smile wasn't just a smile. It was a triumph of willpower over pain, money over decay, and ignorance over microbes. And often it was false, quite literally. You have survived the stench of Victorian streets, endured the agony of their dentistry, and now you find yourself face to face with the ultimate hygienic challenge of the age, the corpse. In an era before funeral parlours, refrigeration, or even a decent understanding of germs, the dead were not whisked away by professionals. They stayed in the house, usually right there in the parlour where the living still gathered, and you were expected to deal with them. The Victorians had an obsession with death that bordered on romantic. Mourning culture was elaborate, filled with black crepe, hair jewellery, and photo portraits of deceased loved ones posed to look asleep. But the reality of the body itself was less poetic. Once the breath left a Victorian chest, hygiene became a race against time. A corpse does not politely wait for mourners to finish their tea. It announces itself almost immediately with a heavy sweetness in the air, like spoiled fruit soaked in iron. The first step was washing the body, not in some sterile tiled mortuary, but in the same bedroom or parlour where life had unfolded. You, a relative or neighbour, would fill basins with water and begin scrubbing. Soap was harsh, made of lye and fat, and the smell mingled with the rising odour of decay. The skin beneath your cloth was already cooling, waxy and mottled. Rigor mortis stiffened the joints, so moving the limbs felt like forcing hinges that had rusted shut. There was no escaping the intimacy. You leaned close, inhaling the faint scent of coal soot from the hair and the sour tang of sweat trapped in clothing that would never be laundered again. Clothing the dead was just as vital. Bodies were often dressed in their best, which meant layers of heavy Victorian fabric. Corsets were tightened, collars buttoned, and shoes forced onto feet that no longer flexed. It was a labour that demanded both strength and indifference. For women, this could mean pinning elaborate gowns, arranging hair, and even applying powders or rouge to restore a semblance of life. Cosmetics doubled as camouflage for the early discolorations that crept across the skin. The body was then laid out in the home. This was called the laying out, or waking, and it could last for days depending on travel times for distant relatives. The corpse would rest in a coffin, or sometimes on a bed, surrounded by candles, flowers, and draperies of black cloth. These weren't just decorative choices. Candles and flowers fought the smell. Lilies, in particular, became associated with funerals because their strong scent could mask the unmistakable sweetness of decomposition. Imagine an entire parlour stuffed with vases of wilting blooms, wax drippings pooling on the mantel, and a body slowly breaking down beneath it all. Victorian homes had no refrigeration, so temperature became the enemy. In the summer, decomposition was alarmingly fast. The odour thickened in the air, clinging to your clothing, your hair, your throat. Flies found their way through cracks and hovered at the edges of curtains. In desperation, families sprinkled chloride of lime, an early disinfectant, around the body, or packed the coffin with sawdust to soak up fluids. Ice was a luxury, sometimes ordered in blocks and placed beneath or around the coffin to delay the inevitable. But most households could not afford such extravagance. They relied instead on ritual speed and sheer endurance of the senses. This intimacy with the dead was not considered grotesque, it was duty. The Victorians lived with death constantly. Infant mortality was high, diseases like cholera or tuberculosis struck suddenly, and life expectancy was far shorter than your own. To wash, dress and watch over the dead was seen as an act of respect, even love. The parlour became the stage where life and death blurred. Neighbours would visit, sitting quietly in the room, sipping tea while a stiff body lay only feet away. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by the occasional buzzing of a fly or the crackle of a candle. For the poorest households, the rituals were rougher. Coffins were simple pine boxes, if they were affordable at all. Sometimes families borrowed coffins for display, returning them after the wake so the undertaker could reuse them. The body itself might be buried in a shroud alone, or wrapped in a blanket. Hygiene was secondary to cost. Entire tenement blocks could be filled with the smell of one family's dead relative waiting for burial. Wealthier households, of course, elevated the ordeal into spectacle. Professional layers out of the dead could be hired to wash and dress the body, sparing relatives the intimate chores. They brought specialised cloths, pins, and sometimes chemicals to delay decay. Elaborate funerary decor, velvet drapes, mourning wreaths, mirrors shrouded in black cloth, turned parlours into temporary chapels. And still, beneath the grandeur there was always the smell. No amount of wealth could erase the fact that bodies rot. Death photography became a macabre fashion. Photographers would come to capture the deceased posed as though still alive. Eyes might be painted onto closed eyelids in the final print, or the body propped upright with hidden stands. Families treasured these images, not as morbid tokens, but as final keepsakes in an age when photography itself was rare. You could stare at a framed photograph of your grandmother for decades, forgetting that when it was taken, the room smelled of lilies desperately outmatched by the scent of her last decline. Then there was the burial itself. Coffins were carried through the streets in black-draped carts, horses plumed with feathers. Mourners followed in long lines, their black clothing a visible sign of grief and hygiene hazard alike. Wool and crepe were heavy fabrics that absorbed odours easily. After a wake, mourners carried the smell of decay in their garments, bringing it with them back into their daily lives. Black was practical for another reason too. It concealed stains from candle wax, coal soot, and the occasional seepage from the coffin. Victorian burial grounds were not sanitary places. Churchyards were overcrowded, graves dug shallow, bodies packed tightly. In London, it was common for older graves to be disturbed when new ones were dug, bones jumbled together beneath the soil. During cholera epidemics, the miasma theory of disease spread fear that the very smell of decomposing bodies could poison the living. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Groundwater contamination was real, and graveyards sometimes leached into wells, seeding the same diseases that killed the deceased. What lingered most, however, was the domestic intimacy with death. You were expected not only to mourn, but to clean, dress, and sit with the corpse in the very home where you ate and slept. Imagine blowing out the candles at night, retreating upstairs, and knowing that downstairs in the parlour, a body stiffened quietly in the dark. The silence pressed against the walls. The smell crept beneath the door. Sleep did not come easily. By the late 19th century, undertakers and funeral parlours began to professionalise the process. Embalming gained popularity, especially after the American Civil War demonstrated its effectiveness in transporting bodies long distances. Victorian England slowly adopted the practice, particularly among the wealthy. But for most of the century, embalming was rare. The ordinary family still washed and dressed their dead, still endured the intimacy of decomposition, still carried lilies into the parlour to mask the smell. So when you think of Victorian mourning culture with its elaborate veils and sentimental poetry, remember the other side of it. The soapy water basins, the waxy stiffness of limbs, the oppressive odour of decay fought desperately with flowers and carbolic. Death was not sanitised or hidden. It was part of the household, part of the air you breathed. And as you sit in that parlour, candlelight flickering, the body lying still only a few feet away, you realise just how differently Victorians understood hygiene. For them, the dead were not a problem to be sent away. They were family to be washed, dressed and watched over. No matter how overpowering the smell became, you've trudged through the coal smoke, endured the rank puddles of sewage trickling along the street gutters, and held your nose in the crowded public house. But now you confront the most intimate and humiliating hygiene fear of all: your own smell. In Victorian England, body odour was not just unpleasant, it was social suicide. Imagine stepping into a crowded drawing room where candlelight glints off crystal glasses, heavy velvet curtains trap the air, and dozens of tightly corseted bodies are squeezed together. There is no electric fan humming in the corner, no discreet spray of deodorant waiting in a bathroom cabinet. Within minutes the heat rises, the air thickens, and the mingled scent of human sweat begins its quiet assault. You can smell it on yourself, you can smell it on others, and everyone is pretending not to notice. This was the age before deodorant as you know it. Antiperspirant sprays would not appear until the early 20th century. Instead, the Victorians waged their war against body odour with perfumes, powders, and sheer determination. The wealthy drenched themselves in colognes. Entire glass bottles of lavender water, eau de cologne, or rose attar were dabbed liberally behind ears, on collars, and onto handkerchiefs. A polite guest might press a perfumed cloth to their nose while walking through the streets, ostensibly to block miasmas, the bad air thought to spread disease, but also to politely avoid inhaling your natural aroma. Soap, of course, was another weapon. By the mid-19th century, the British soap industry was booming, with companies like Pears marketing their products as a pathway to moral respectability. Soap was not just about washing dirt from your body, it was about scrubbing away the suspicion of vice, poverty, or weakness. Cleanliness was equated with godliness, and the unwashed were viewed with disdain. But soap was still expensive, and for the working poor, a bar was precious. Many households saved it for laundry or visible surfaces like faces and hands, leaving the rest of the body to fend for itself. The result was a society where perfumes battled sweat and flowers fought with filth. Clothing made matters worse. Layers upon layers of fabric trapped heat and moisture. Men wore wool suits even in the summer. Women endured corsets, petticoats and long skirts that brushed the filthy streets. Airflow was minimal. Sweat soaked into the fabric and lingered for days, since laundering full outfits was rare. Instead, clothing was brushed, aired, or sprinkled with powders between wears. The smell never truly left. It built into a permanent bouquet of musk and mildew that followed you like a shadow. The Victorians also believed strongly in the connection between smell and morality. The idea of miasma theory, that disease spread through foul air, shaped how people judged both spaces and bodies. If you smelled bad, it wasn't just an assault on the nose. It suggested you were unhealthy, unclean, and possibly immoral. Working-class people, forced into sweat-drenched labour and unable to afford frequent baths or perfumes, were stigmatised for their odour. Their smell became shorthand for their social class. The upper classes, meanwhile, hid behind perfumed veils of rose, sandalwood and lavender, as though good breeding itself came bottled in crystal. Public spaces reflected this obsession. Churches burned incense. Theatres reeked of cheap colognes as audiences doused themselves before crowding into close quarters. Even funerals were drenched in lilies and heavy floral arrangements, designed less for symbolism and more to mask the stench of the recently deceased. Everywhere you went, there was an underlying battle: natural human odour versus the artificial shield of perfume. For those who could afford them, perfumed accessories became fashionable. Scented gloves were soaked in oils of violet or orange blossom. Pocket squares were doused in cologne and pressed subtly to noses during carriage rides. Even jewellery could conceal perfume. Lockets were designed to hold tiny sponges soaked in scent, worn close to the body to ward off both illness and embarrassment. The goal was not only to smell sweet, but to avoid inhaling the supposed poisonous airs of the city. But perfume had its drawbacks. Overuse became its own problem. Step into a parlour where 10 guests had each poured half a vial of rosewater on themselves, and you were greeted with a suffocating fog of sweetness. Instead of masking sweat, it blended with it, creating what one satirical writer described as the odour of roses laid in a stable. The Victorians carried on anyway, convinced that layers of perfume could outwit biology. At the same time, new products emerged to target body odour more directly. Powders made of starch or alum were sprinkled under arms or onto clothing to absorb moisture. Some even recommended rubbing vinegar or spirits onto the skin as a disinfectant. The effect was minimal at best and often uncomfortable. Vinegar left its own pungent tang. Alum could irritate the skin. Still, desperate Victorians endured it, because the shame of being offensive was worse than a rash. Bathing practices also played a role. The wealthy might have a copper tub brought to their room, filled with buckets of hot water hauled by servants. These baths were rare luxuries, perhaps once a week or less. The working poor, meanwhile, might never bathe fully at all. Washing consisted of splashing the face and hands at a basin, or dipping a cloth into cold water and scrubbing the visible parts. The rest of the body was left alone, shielded by clothing and ignored until the odour forced action. Soap again was rationed carefully. For many, perfume was not a luxury but a necessity to cover what could not be washed away. The connection between body odour and class grew so strong that even literature reflected it. Novels described villains as having foul breath or unwashed bodies, while heroines smelled of roses and violets. To stink was to be suspect. To smell sweet was to be trustworthy. The nose became a tool of judgment, and you, sweating in your wool suit or corseted gown, were constantly aware of the silent scrutiny around you. Even medical advice fixated on odour. Doctors warned that foul smells signalled disease, while sweet perfumes could ward it off. Miasma theory insisted that cholera, typhus and plague travelled through bad air, so people clung to scents as protective charms. Walk through a cholera-stricken neighbourhood, and you might see mothers pressing posies to their children's faces, hoping the flowers could filter death itself. Of course, the irony is that much of this focus on smell distracted from the real causes of disease. Cholera spread through contaminated water, not through body odour. Tuberculosis spread through droplets, not sweat. But in the Victorian imagination, your personal smell mattered more than any germ. A whiff of foulness could condemn you. A splash of lavender water could save your reputation. The pressure to smell pleasant even extended into death. Bodies were perfumed with oils, coffins filled with flowers, and mourners cloaked in scented fabrics. Death was expected to be as fragrant as life. Yet beneath it all, the raw human reality lingered. Sweat, decay, and coal dust clung stubbornly to every layer of the age. Perfume was the polite fiction that society agreed to uphold. So there you are, in a crowded parlour, a bead of sweat trickling under your collar, your wool suit clinging to your back. You dab your handkerchief across your neck, reapply a splash of cologne, and pray that no one notices. Everyone else is doing the same. The air is thick with violets, lavender and musk, yet somehow still human. And as you breathe it in, you realise that the great Victorian fear was not simply of body odour itself, but of what it revealed. Class, health, even morality. Nothing in Victorian life could ever truly prepare you for the olfactory nightmare that awaited in the toilet. Or rather, in the near-complete lack of one. Step into a cramped back alley of an industrial city. Rows of tenement houses stretch endlessly, their bricks blackened by coal soot. The streets are alive with horses, their droppings piling up faster than carts can haul it away. Now glance behind those houses and you'll see the true horror. The privy. A simple wooden shed, leaning precariously, with a hole carved above a pit that collects everything you and your neighbours have deposited for weeks. There is no flush, no running water, no sewage pipe to whisk it away. Just a pit, buzzing with flies, wafting its stench into the warm summer air. Inside, the experience is worse. The wooden seat is damp, warped and sticky. The air is thick and sour. Beneath you, a black pool bubbles faintly, alive with gases and crawling with life you wish you had never learned existed. Each breath feels like swallowing decay. You hold your nose, but it barely helps. The stench sticks to your clothes, your skin, even your imagination. And yet, this was normal. Most working-class families relied on shared outdoor privies or cesspits, often serving dozens of people. Emptying them was the job of the night soil men, who crept through the streets in the darkness with buckets and carts. Their work was dangerous and degrading, hauling tons of waste out of pits and transporting it out of the city. Some was dumped into rivers, some was sold as fertilizer, most simply reappeared in the air you breathed or the water you drank. For the wealthier classes, the situation was only marginally better. The invention of the flush toilet had technically arrived in the 16th century, but it was not until the Victorian age that it spread more widely. By the mid-19th century, wealthy households might have a water closet with a porcelain bowl and a crude flushing system. But plumbing was primitive. Pipes often emptied directly into cesspools beneath the house, or, even worse, straight into the Thames. Imagine flushing proudly, only to realise that you had merely relocated your problem to the river that provided your drinking water. The results were catastrophic. The Thames, once romanticised for its gentle flow, became a ribbon of filth. Dead animals floated alongside human waste. Industrial runoff painted it black with chemicals. And the smell. Oh, the smell. In the summer of 1858, known to history as the Great Stink, the heat baked the river until it became unbearable. The odour was so powerful that the British Parliament, whose chambers stood right beside the river, was forced to hang soaked curtains of lime chloride to block the stench. Politicians gagged as they tried to pass laws, their speeches drowned out by the hum of flies and the groans of nausea. Cholera outbreaks swept through London again and again. killing tens of thousands. At the time, people still clung to the belief that foul air itself, the miasma, was to blame. But it was a physician named John Snow who demonstrated that cholera spread through contaminated water, not through the smell. In 1854, during a devastating outbreak in Soho, Snow traced the cases back to a single public pump on Broad Street. He famously removed the pump handle and the outbreak subsided. Yet even with this evidence, it took years for the full truth to sink in. That sewage in water, not the stench in the air, was the real killer. This realization sparked one of the great engineering projects of the Victorian age. In the 1860s, Joseph Basil Gett designed a massive sewage system for London. Enormous brick-lined tunnels were constructed beneath the city, channeling waste far downstream and away from the water supply. It was an undertaking so vast that some of those sewers are still in use today. Basil Gett's foresight even included making the pipes wider than necessary, anticipating future population growth. Ironically, his decision to oversize them saved London from disaster again in the 20th century, when the city had doubled in size. Still, before this system, life stank, quite literally. Public toilets were scarce and relieving yourself outdoors was common. Rivers, ditches, and even stairwells served as impromptu latrines. Reports from sanitary reformers describe entire neighbourhoods where sewage ran openly down the streets, mixing with rainwater and mud. Children played in it. Adults trudged through it daily. The air hung thick with it. In the countryside, things were only a little better. Privies were dug behind cottages, often uphill from wells that provided drinking water. Heavy rains washed the waste downhill, seeping into water supplies. Outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid became regular features of village life. Smell and sickness were inseparable, and for many Victorians, death itself carried the stench of sewage. The obsession with masking odour extended here too. Lime was sprinkled into pits to reduce smell. Carbolic acid, one of the earliest disinfectants, was poured liberally to kill germs and neutralise gases. Perfumed soaps and air fresheners were marketed specifically for lavatories, yet the underlying problem remained. You could drown a cesspit in lavender water, but you could not perfume your way out of cholera. Even the design of toilets revealed the Victorian struggle with smell. Early flush models often had poor seals, allowing gases from sewers to seep back up into homes. Households reported sewer explosions when methane ignited, sometimes blowing lids off water closets. The paranoia over deadly gases was not entirely misplaced. Sewer air was foul, but the true danger came from microbes unseen. Unfortunately, Victorians could not smell bacteria, so they continued to chase odours instead. As you sit in your Victorian water closet, perhaps proud of the porcelain beneath you, you can hear the faint echo of the sewer below. A warm draught wafts upward, carrying with it a reminder of everything you thought you had flushed away. The candle flickers. You gag quietly, splash a little cologne on your handkerchief, and hope no one notices when you emerge, your clothes clinging to the perfume of both roses and rot. By the late 19th century, improvements in plumbing, the spread of piped water, and the enforcement of sanitary laws began to change the landscape. Yet for much of the era, toilets remained symbols of both progress and horror. They promised cleanliness but delivered stench. They offered convenience but invited disease. And for ordinary Victorians, the daily battle against sewage was a reminder that civilization was only ever one cracked pipe away from collapse. So there you are, standing by the Thames on a hot day, the river glistening with sewage, the air so thick you can taste it. You watch barges drift lazily by, their crews gagging as they pass Parliament's windows. The city smells like a compost heap set on fire, and somehow life carries on. And there you have it, the Victorian toilet disaster, proof that nothing ruins an empire's sense of dignity quite like the smell of its own sewage. Now, if you somehow still want to learn more about the Victorians, you're in luck. I've got another story waiting that will make you feel even more grateful for your indoor plumbing. And there you have it, Victorian hygiene in all its fragrant glory. Proof that the past didn't just stink metaphorically, it stank in every possible direction. If you're lying there thinking, wow, I'd actually rather live in the 1800s, then congratulations, you've officially lost your sense of smell. But if you'd prefer to keep enjoying showers, toothpaste and plumbing that doesn't explode under your chair, go ahead and hit that like button, maybe even subscribe before you flush, and tell me in the comments, what's grosser, sharing a toothbrush with your Victorian neighbours, or drinking water that literally doubled as a toilet? Because either way, tonight you can fall asleep grateful for one thing: your bathroom doesn't require a shovel,